Okay, so, a small-town police chief raped a schoolteacher in her own classroom. Years later, he shot a man dead on the side of the road. 2 life sentences. And then, get this, he escaped prison by dressing up as a guard and just walking out the front gate. And that's case 1. Case 2 is an LAPD officer who got fired. So he wrote a manifesto, 11,000 words, named 40 people he wanted dead. Then he actually went and did it. Turned half of Southern California into a manhunt for 9 straight days. And the third guy? Honestly, this one's hard to even summarize. He showed up at a family's front door pretending to be someone they could trust. 20 minutes later, 6 people were on that living room floor. Only one of them made it out. Let's get into it.
A former police chief serving time for rape and murder who slipped out by dressing up in a makeshift police officer uniform.
An evil man. He should not be trusted.
In one word, I would say he is a sociopath.
It's 3 minutes to 3 in the afternoon on a Sunday in May. A man dressed in black is walking across the grounds of a medium-security prison in northern Arkansas. He's pushing a small cart. The cart has a cardboard box on it, some stacked wooden pallets, and what looks, from a distance, like just routine groundskeeping equipment. He walks past the front of an industrial building. He turns toward the back gate of the prison, a vehicle gate, the kind that opens for delivery trucks, not for foot traffic. He stops in front of the security tower. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't show ID. He just stands there looking like a man who belongs. The corrections officer in the tower glances at him. Black t-shirt, black pants, black baseball cap, the shape of a uniform, the shape of a person who works here. The phone in the tower starts ringing. The officer reaches for it. Without looking back, he hits the button to open the gate. The man with the cart walks through. By the time anyone realizes what just happened, he is 1.5 miles into the woods of the Ozark Mountains, and he is the most dangerous escaped prisoner in the United States that week. His name is GrantHardin. He is 56 years old, a convicted murderer, and a convicted rapist. And he is, by any reasonable accounting of his life, the single worst hire in the history of a small-town police department called Gateway, Arkansas, because before he was an inmate, before he was the subject of an HBO documentary called Devil in the Ozarks, before he was the reason that prison in Calico Rock had its first escape in 35 years, he was the chief of police. What I want to walk you through today is the full story of GrantHardin, the murder in 2017 that put him in prison in the first place, the cold case from 1997 that nobody could solve for 21 years until his own DNA gave him up, and the escape last spring, how he planned it for 6 months, what he built, what he wore, and how he turned a back gate at a prison full of murderers into the easiest exit in Arkansas. Hit subscribe if you do true crime. Takes 2 seconds, totally free, and it helps me keep these going. Quick warning before we get into it. Parts of this case involve violence against a teacher. I'm going to handle that part carefully and won't be walking through graphic detail. Okay, let's go. To understand GrantHardin, you have to start with the smallness of the town where he ended up being chief. But first, a word about where he started. Hardin grew up in Garfield, Arkansas, which is even smaller than Gateway. Garfield is a town in Benton County with a population that's hovered around 500 people for decades. The kind of place where, if you wanted out of a quiet life in a quiet town, the natural step was either to leave the state or to find a job that gave you authority you couldn't otherwise get. Hardin chose authority. By the early 1990s, he had started his way into law enforcement, eventually picking up positions at a handful of small Arkansas police departments, including a stint at the Eureka Springs PD in the historic Victorian tourist town about 30 miles south of Garfield. Eureka Springs is, in its own way, an interesting place for a young cop to start. It's small, it's quirky, the full-time police force is tiny, and it sits in a region where, by the accounts of local journalists who have covered the case since, police departments hire from a shallow labor pool and often keep officers on who, in a bigger metropolitan area, would not have made it through the screening. Hardin's resume from that period is, by every account, full of brief stints and short tenures. He didn't stay anywhere long. There's no public record I've been able to find that says exactly why each of those jobs ended. But the pattern of a young law enforcement officer who bounces from small town to small town never quite settling in, is the kind of pattern that, if anyone in a hiring office had paid attention, should have been a yellow flag by the time he arrived in Gateway. Gateway, Arkansas is the kind of place that, if you blinked while driving, you'd miss it. Population about 400, tucked into the very northwestern corner of the state, near the Missouri border, in the foothills of the Ozarks. One main road, a handful of businesses, a volunteer fire department, the kind of town where the city council meets in a room above the post office and where being police chief means you and maybe one or two officers handle every call that comes in. In early 2016, that job opened up in Gateway. The town needed a new chief. GrantHardin applied. On paper, he had what looked like a decent resume. He had bounced around several small police departments in northwest Arkansas through the 1990s, including a stint with the Eureka Springs Police Department. He had been out of regular law enforcement for a while by then, working at the Northwest Arkansas Community Correction Center in Fayetteville as a correctional officer. But the Gateway City Council took a look at his file and gave him the badge. It went badly almost immediately. By the accounts of the people who lived there at the time, and a lot of these accounts came out later in the 2023 HBO documentary, Devil in the Ozarks, GrantHardin was not a normal police chief. He was the police chief who would, by his own town's later complaint to the city council, drive around chasing cars that hadn't done anything wrong, just to see if he could catch them. He pulled his sidearm on people who were not, by any reasonable interpretation, threatening him. The previous mayor of Gateway, a man named Andrew Tillman, told reporters years later that the new chief's behavior on the job had been so erratic from the start that nobody in town quite knew what to do with him. The city council figured it out within about 4 months. They gave Hardin an ultimatum, resign or be fired. He resigned. He went back to his corrections officer job in Fayetteville, picked up his paychecks there, and kept living in the area. 9 months later, on the morning of February 23, 2017, James Appleton was sitting in his work truck in Gateway. He was on the phone with his brother-in-law, Andrew Tillman, the former mayor, the same guy who had been on the city council when they'd cut Hardin loose. The two men talked for a few minutes. Then, somewhere in the middle of the conversation, Tillman heard a sharp sound on the line. He thought at first that maybe Appleton had dropped the phone. Then the line went quiet. A driver passing in the opposite direction at that moment heard what he later described as a rifle shot. He saw a white car pulling away from the scene at speed. He drove on for a beat, processed what he had just heard, and then turned around to check. James Appleton was 59 years old. He had worked for the city of Gateway's water department for years. He had never had any kind of public dispute with anyone in town, except, by the prosecution's later account, with GrantHardin. The exact source of the friction between the two men has never been fully detailed in court documents, but multiple witnesses had heard about ongoing tension between them in the months leading up to that morning. Whatever Appleton had done in Hardin's mind to deserve what came next, only Hardin ever knew. He has never said. The driver who turned around found Appleton in his truck, alone, with a gunshot wound to the head. He called 911 and waited. The investigation that followed was, by Arkansas State Police standards, fast. The white car had been spotted leaving the scene. The witness gave a description detailed enough to point investigators at GrantHardin almost immediately. Within hours, deputies had located him. Within a day, ballistics and other evidence had filled in enough of the picture to file charges. By October of that year, 8 months after the killing, Hardin was in a Benton County courtroom pleading guilty to first-degree murder. The plea, in legal terms, spared the family a trial. It also meant, and this is the part that has haunted the Appleton and Tillman families ever since, that Hardin never had to publicly explain himself. There was no testimony. There was no narrative laid out on a witness stand. No motive was ever entered into the court record beyond the prosecution's framing of cold-blooded violence. James Appleton's family was left to live, indefinitely, with the question of why a former police chief had decided that February morning that their husband, brother, uncle, friend was the man he was going to shoot. Andrew Tillman, the former mayor, has spoken publicly multiple times since the conviction about what it was like to be on the phone in the seconds before his brother-in-law died. He has talked about hearing the sound, about the seconds of confusion afterward, about the moment of recognition when he understood that the call had not been disconnected by accident. He has also talked, in the HBO documentary years later, about the slow process of putting together that the person who had been chief of his own town's police department might have been the person who had done it. Tillman did not, he later said, immediately suspect Hardin. Even after the council had asked Hardin to resign, even after the man's behavior on the job had been documented, Tillman had not assumed that there was a violent killer inside the body of the cop they had hired. That assumption took shape only after the white car was identified, and the name attached to it was a name everyone in Gateway already knew. The sentence came down at the same hearing: 30 years in prison. That should have been the end of the story. A man who had once briefly worn a chief's uniform was now wearing a state prison jumpsuit, and James Appleton's family had the small comfort of knowing the man who killed him was going away for what, at his age, was effectively the rest of his life. It wasn't the end of the story, not even close. Because the day GrantHardin walked into the Arkansas state prison system on a murder conviction, the routine intake processing included a standard procedure that, in every other case before his, had been the most boring administrative step there is: a DNA cheek swab. His sample went into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the same federal database that links every DNA profile collected from any convicted person to every DNA profile collected from any crime scene. In most cases, the database returns nothing. In GrantHardin's case in early 2018, it returned a match. The match was to a sexual assault that had happened in 1997, 21 years earlier. I want to slow down and tell you about that case properly, because Amy Harrison, who is the survivor of what happened in 1997, has spoken about it publicly, in court, and in television interviews, and has been clear that she wants people to know what happened to her and what it took to put the man who did it in prison. Her courage is the entire reason the cold case ever got closed. Amy Harrison was 27 years old in November of 1997. She was a third-grade teacher at Frank Tillery Elementary School in Rogers, Arkansas, about 50 miles south of Gateway. She had been married for a few years. Her husband was a local police officer. She was, at that point in her life, taking night classes at the University of Arkansas, working toward a law degree. The plan was to eventually become an attorney. She loved teaching, but she had bigger ambitions, and she was working toward them at the same time she was running a classroom of 8-year-olds. On Sunday, November 9, 1997, Amy went into the school. She was there to prepare her lesson plans for the upcoming week. Getting the classroom ready was the kind of weekend work that elementary school teachers across the country routinely do. Sunday mornings at Frank Tillery were not, by any measure, an unusual time for teachers to be in the building. There was something else going on at the school that day, too. The cafeteria was being used for a church service. Over 250 people were in the building. Amy thought she was alone in her wing. She had her materials out. She left the classroom for a couple of minutes to use the restroom in the teacher's lounge. When she came out of the restroom, there was a man standing in the doorway blocking her exit. He was wearing a knit stocking cap pulled down to obscure his face. He had on sunglasses. He was holding a handgun, pointed at her. He took her back into the bathroom. He sexually assaulted her there. He then moved her to a classroom and assaulted her again. Throughout the assault, and this detail, when it later came out in court, was the part that I think gave investigators the most about who they were dealing with. He was meticulously careful. He didn't touch surfaces in a way that would leave fingerprints. He asked her questions while it was happening. One of the questions, by her later account to investigators, was whether she recognized his voice. She didn't. When it was over, he left. Amy got herself out of the classroom and found a janitor working in another part of the building. The janitor called 911. Rogers police arrived. The on-site sexual assault forensic nurse, a critically important detail, because Rogers had one of the more forward-thinking sexual assault nurse examiner programs in Arkansas at that point, collected DNA evidence from Amy's clothing. I want to pause for a second on that program, because the existence of a trained sexual assault nurse examiner, a sane nurse, at Rogers in 1997 is the single most important detail in why this case was ever solvable. Sane programs were, in the late 1990s, a relatively new innovation in American medicine. Most hospitals did not have specialists trained specifically in collecting forensic evidence from assault survivors. The work was often done by emergency room staff who had no specific training, with the result that crucial evidence, fibers, DNA traces, time-sensitive samples, got contaminated, missed, or mishandled. Rogers, Arkansas, of all places, had been an early adopter. The nurse who handled Amy Harrison's case that morning knew exactly what to collect and how to preserve it. Without that single professional decision, 21 years later, the DNA match that closed the case would not have existed. The investigation that followed was thorough. Officers canvassed everyone in the building, interviewed all 250-plus churchgoers, looked at every man in the area who might match the limited physical description Amy could give them. None of it produced a suspect. The forensic evidence was strong. They had DNA, they had a profile. But in 1997, you could only match a profile if you had something to match it to. The combined DNA index system was still in its infancy. There was no national database to compare against. 6 years went by. The case went cold. In 2003, with the Arkansas statute of limitations on the charges starting to expire, the Rogers Police Department did something clever. The Rogers police chief at the time, Hayes Minor, had read about a technique that had been pioneered in Milwaukee. They called it a John Doe warrant, an arrest warrant for an unknown person, identified only by their DNA profile. The warrant locks in the legal clock. As long as the warrant exists, the statute of limitations does not run out. Whenever the day came that the DNA matched a real human being, the warrant would already be in place to arrest them. Rogers police filed a John Doe warrant on Amy's case in 2003. Then they waited. They waited for 15 years. The CBS true crime show Cold Justice Sex Crimes came to Rogers at one point to work the case alongside local investigators. The show had been pairing former prosecutors and retired investigators with local police departments to take fresh looks at sexual assault cold cases. The team spent time in Rogers reviewing the original file, interviewing witnesses, and consulting with the local detectives. By every later account from people involved, the Cold Justice team got as close as anyone before them to identifying a suspect, but eventually had to leave Rogers without the case being solved. Television production schedules being what they are, they could not stay indefinitely. Amy stayed in touch with the show's investigators afterward. By her own account, she was not going to let the case be forgotten. January 29, 2018. The DNA crime lab at the Arkansas State Police got a hit. The profile from Amy's case matched a sample that had been entered into the system after a recent murder conviction. The convict's name was GrantHardin. The Rogers Police Department, the Arkansas State Crime Lab, and the Benton County Prosecutor's Office spent the next several months building the case. The forensic match was, in the words of the prosecutor who later handled it, Nathan Smith, proven to be Mr. Hardin beyond all scientific certainty. Hardin was already incarcerated on the Appleton murder. They didn't have to find him. They just had to charge him. In February of 2019, Hardin appeared in court and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of rape. The judge sentenced him to 25 years on each count to run consecutively. 50 years on top of the 30 he was already serving for James Appleton's murder. 80 years total. Hardin, who was at that point 50 years old, was, by the math, never going to be a free man again. Amy Harrison came to that sentencing hearing. She had been waiting 21 years to look at the person who had done this to her. She got her chance in a Benton County courtroom in front of her family, her friends, and the press. She stood up. She read a statement she had prepared. She said the line that I want you to hear in her own framing, because it is, by far, the most powerful single moment in the public record of this case. She told Hardin directly, "I am not a victim. I didn't deserve this. This was you, and you deserve to go to prison." She told him she was going to use her free will to overcome what he had done to her. She said she was going to walk out of the courthouse with her family and her friends and enjoy the fresh air before she went home. She said she hoped her story would be an encouragement to other survivors fighting for justice in cases that had been dismissed or shelved or forgotten. Then she walked out of the courtroom. That was supposed to be the end of it. The Rogers police chief at the time told reporters that without Amy's courage and her persistence with the case, none of it would have happened. Hardin was on a one-way trip to spending the rest of his life at the Arkansas Department of Corrections. 6 years passed. Hardin served his time at the North Central Unit, the medium-security state prison in Calico Rock, in the northern part of Arkansas. The facility houses about 800 inmates. By the accounts of corrections officials who later spoke to the press, Hardin was a model prisoner during those years. He didn't get into fights. He didn't accumulate disciplinary write-ups. He worked. He kept his head down. The kind of inmate who, in the daily eye test that corrections officers run on the people they supervise, did not pop, did not seem like a problem. The 8-year prison record on him, which was reviewed by the post-escape investigation, was almost completely clean. He had earned, in correctional terms, what's called good behavior credit, small reductions in his sentence given for steady, non-disruptive conduct. He had been promoted within the prison work assignment system multiple times. The kitchen job he held by the time of the escape was, by Arkansas DOC's own classification, considered a position of trust. The prisoners who get those jobs are, by design, the ones the staff believes will not abuse the slightly expanded access. Hardin had passed every internal review designed to identify the inmates likely to try something, until he didn't. That gap between the steady, model inmate persona he presented for 8 years and the meticulous escape plan he was quietly building underneath it is the part of the post-incident report that, frankly, gives me the most chills, because it suggests that the same patient compartmentalization that let him work the kitchen by day and dye fabric in increments by night was the same skill set that had allowed him, in 1997, to ambush a teacher in a school during a church service and walk back out without leaving witnesses, and the same skill set that had allowed him, in 2017, to drive to James Appleton's truck in Gateway and back out of town with nobody knowing what he had just done until the witness turned his car around. He had been working in the prison kitchen. That detail matters, because over the course of the 6 months leading up to May of 2025, GrantHardin had been quietly using his kitchen access to do something the Arkansas Department of Corrections had not, at any point, caught him doing. He was building an escape. Before I walk you through what he built, I want to say something about the HBO documentary that turned this case from a regional Arkansas story into a national one. Devil in the Ozarks came out on what was then HBO Max in 2023, a 3-part series produced by HBO's documentary unit. The filmmakers had been working on the project for years before its release. They interviewed Andrew Tillman, the former mayor and brother-in-law of James Appleton, multiple times. They got access to court records, police interview footage, and former Gateway officials who had been on the city council when Hardin was hired. Importantly, they had also talked to Amy Harrison. The documentary, by the accounts of viewers and critics, did something that a lot of true crime series struggle with. It gave roughly equal weight to both victims. It did not, in the words of one reviewer at the time, fixate on the killer. It walked through Appleton's life as a water department employee in Gateway, through Amy's life as a teacher, and through the 15-year cold case from her perspective. It also raised, in its final episode, the question that would become eerily prescient. What was GrantHardin doing with his time in prison? Was he the kind of inmate corrections officials should be watching closely? The documentary did not answer that question. Roughly 2 years after it aired, Hardin would answer it himself. Working in food service inside a prison gives you access to things you would not, on the face of it, expect to be useful for an escape. Kitchen aprons, empty food cans, the back rooms of the facility, including utility spaces that are rarely inspected by guards because there's no reason for an inmate to be hiding anything in a flour storage closet. According to the Arkansas State Police Critical Incident Review Committee that investigated the escape afterward, Hardin spent that half-year quietly gathering materials. He took kitchen aprons and started cutting and reshaping them. He stripped colors from white prison-issue clothing. He used a black Sharpie marker. Somebody had handed him one at some point, or he had palmed one during access to office supplies, or he had simply found one to systematically dye fabric. He used empty food cans, opened up and flattened, to create what would later be described in the official report as a handmade badge. He stashed all of it in spots inside the kitchen that nobody routinely checked. The level of patience involved in that preparation is the part of the case that, the more I read about it, the harder it gets to wrap my head around. This was not a man making a sudden break for it. This was a man who, over the course of about 180 days, did a few minutes of work on the project each day. A piece of apron in the morning, a scrap of can in the afternoon. A test of how black he could get a white shirt by repeatedly going over it with a marker. The cumulative effort, hour by hour, gradually produced everything he would need for one specific Sunday afternoon in May. A note about the Sharpie itself. State Senator Ben Gilmore of Crossett, Arkansas, raised the question publicly at a legislative hearing later in the summer. Where, exactly, did Hardin get those markers? Permanent markers are not standard issue in a corrections facility. Pen access is restricted. Sharpies in particular are not the kind of object a prison kitchen would normally stock. The senator told the committee that he had not been able to get an answer, and that the question had been driving him crazy. The Department of Corrections, at that hearing, did not have a clear response. The director said that part of the ongoing investigation was looking into whether Hardin had received any contraband help from inside the facility, whether from another inmate or from a staff member or from both. That investigation is, as far as the public record goes, still open. He also built, out of wooden pallets and whatever else he could scavenge, a small homemade ladder. The ladder was a backup. The plan was to walk out through the front of the prison if he could manage it. The ladder was just in case he had to scale a fence. On May 25, 2025, a Sunday afternoon, Hardin put the plan into motion. He had timed it for the shift change. He wore the dyed black t-shirt, the dyed black pants, the black baseball cap. He had a vest. He had the badge. He pushed a wheeled cart with a box on it and the wooden pallets stacked behind. The pallets, the ladder, broken down to look like nothing, were sitting right in front of the guards he passed on his way out. At 2:53 p.m., the prison's own security cameras captured him stepping out of a blind spot near the back dock of the kitchen building. He walked along a paved path. He pushed the cart toward the sally port, the back gate, the one normally reserved for vehicles. The officer assigned to monitor that gate from the control tower was a man named Walker. Walker would later tell investigators that the figure approaching the gate looked at a distance like one of his co-workers. The black uniform, the hat, the vest, the cart. Walker did not pick up the radio. He did not ask the figure to swipe a badge. He did not request a verbal identification. A phone in the tower rang. Walker turned to answer it. As he was doing that, he hit the button to release the gate, on the assumption that the officer he thought he was looking at needed it open. He answered the phone. He turned back. The man and the cart were gone. The disappearance was not noticed for approximately 20 minutes. The next scheduled head count came around. The math didn't add up, and one of the corrections officers walked the floor calling Hardin's name. No answer. Officials checked the kitchen. They checked the yard. They reviewed the gate camera. By the time the prison realized what had happened, GrantHardin had been at large, on foot, in the rugged terrain of the Arkansas Ozarks for somewhere around half an hour. The Department of Corrections announced the escape that evening. The community of Calico Rock, a town of about 1,500 people, sitting in the kind of remote North Arkansas landscape that's mostly woods, ridges, creek beds, and very few roads, went into a state of alert that nobody had experienced in living memory. Schools changed their plans for the following day. Parents drove kids to bus stops instead of letting them walk. Sheriff's deputies started running checkpoints on the small state highways out of town. The state's correctional system put out an immediate alert to law enforcement across Arkansas. The FBI was looped in by the next morning. A man who had murdered James Appleton in cold blood, raped Amy Harrison in 1997, and was now on the loose in the foothills of the Ozarks, was, by the math of his crimes and his disposition, the most dangerous person on the loose in the United States that week. 2 phone calls had to happen that night that nobody, including the corrections officials placing them, wanted to make. One went to the Appleton family in Gateway. One went to Amy Harrison. The man who had been put away for hurting them was, as of 3 o'clock that afternoon, not actually put away anymore. Amy Harrison, in an interview with a regional Arkansas reporter a few days into the manhunt, did not hide what hearing that call had done to her. She said the news had reopened a wound she had spent years sealing. She had built her post-2019 life on the assumption that the man who had attacked her at Frank Tillery Elementary was, definitively, in a state prison cell. The phone call from law enforcement that Sunday night undid that assumption in a single sentence. She did not, by her own account, sleep through that night. She did not sleep through most of the following week. The Appleton family, who have been notably less public throughout the case than Amy Harrison has chosen to be, gave a short statement through a family representative during the manhunt. The statement asked for privacy. The statement also asked in plain language for the man who had killed James to be returned to prison as fast as possible. They did not, by every account, leave their homes much during those 12 days. They watched the news. They waited. I want to talk for a minute about what manhunts in that part of Arkansas actually look like. Because if you've never been to the Ozarks, the geography is the whole story. The country around Calico Rock is not flat farmland. It's not suburban. It's the kind of terrain where you can be a half-mile from a paved road and effectively be in wilderness. Ridges, hollows, creeks, thick underbrush, old logging tracks that don't appear on any map. The kind of country where if you know what you're doing and you have any kind of provisions, you can disappear for a long time. Within 48 hours, the search effort was up to hundreds of officers, Arkansas State Police, local sheriff's deputies from Izard, Stone, and Baxter counties, U.S. Marshals Service, FBI tracking teams, U.S. Border Patrol K-9 units, who had been brought in specifically because Border Patrol dogs are some of the best trained scent dogs in the country. Helicopters were running grid patterns overhead. Drones were checking the steeper terrain that the helicopters couldn't get low enough on. Spotter planes were watching for movement. And then, almost as soon as the search got going, the weather broke. Northern Arkansas got hit by a series of heavy thunderstorms that grounded the helicopters, washed out scent trails, and turned dirt logging roads into mud. The K-9 teams that had picked up partial scents on the first afternoon lost them by the second night. The search teams kept going, but the conditions made it almost impossible to do the methodical sweep that this kind of manhunt requires. Meanwhile, Hardin had stuck to his plan. He had stashed a bag of food before the escape, somewhere in the area outside the prison fence, somewhere he could access on foot. By his own later statements to corrections officials, he had intended to hide in the woods for up to 6 months if that's what it took. He moved west from the prison after the initial breakout. On the second night, he made one tactical mistake. He set his food supply bag down somewhere while he scouted the immediate area, and search teams crossed between him and where he had left it. He couldn't get back to it. From that point forward, by his own account, he was eating whatever he could find. Wild plants, small forageable things, the kind of survival foraging that you can only do if you've thought ahead and know what's safe in the local ecosystem. The town of Calico Rock spent 12 days living through this. Imagine, if you can, what it's like to be a small town where the public is being told by the sheriff's office, every night, that a convicted murderer-rapist is somewhere within walking distance of your front door. Some residents barricaded themselves inside. Some armed themselves. Some kept their kids home from school. The state's correctional system had to send representatives to community meetings to try to explain what had happened and what was being done. The answers were not satisfying. Nobody could really explain how the back gate of a prison had just been opened for an inmate. The local diner became, by necessity, the unofficial news center of the manhunt. Patrols would come through for coffee between shifts. State troopers stopped by during shift breaks. The town's pastor canceled the regular evening prayer service the first week, then brought it back as a community gathering with state police representatives present to answer questions. The county sheriff's office set up a tip line. They got several thousand calls over the course of the 12 days. Most of them were nothing. People in nearby counties who had seen a man at a gas station who looked like the photo. A handful of them were close enough to be worth running down. None of them ever led to him. On day 5, the Search Command Center had to relocate twice because of severe weather. National Weather Service rainfall totals for that week in northern Arkansas exceeded 6 inches in some areas. Local creeks that the search teams had been planning to track along had become impassable. The K-9 handlers had to rotate dogs more frequently because the wet conditions exhausted them faster than dry weather would. A spokesperson for the Arkansas Department of Corrections gave press conferences every afternoon at 5 o'clock, in front of a podium set up outside the Calico Rock Community Center, telling reporters what they could share and what they couldn't. What they couldn't share, mostly, was the truth, which was that they didn't know where he was. He was somewhere within a search radius that kept expanding. There had been no confirmed sightings, no surfacings, no calls or contact with anyone he might have known. He was, as far as anyone knew, doing exactly what he had told corrections officials he had planned to do if it came to that, staying hidden in the rough country and waiting it out. On Friday, June 6, 2025, at approximately 3:45 p.m., 13 days after the escape, tracking dogs working a search pattern in the woods near Moccasin Creek in Izard County, about a mile and a half to the northwest of the prison, picked up a fresh scent. Hardin had not gone far. He had circled. He had been moving in and out of the same general piece of rough country, doubling back on his own tracks, trying to stay invisible. When the dog teams converged on his position, Hardin was in a small ravine, hungry, dehydrated, exhausted. He had been eating berries and creek water for several days at that point. U.S. Border Patrol agents and Arkansas state law enforcement officers took him into custody without further incident. The arrest was, by every account, anticlimactic. He didn't fight. He didn't run. The Border Patrol photograph released after the recapture is the one that, more than any other image from this case, told the country what 12 days in the Ozarks had done to him. The man in the picture was thinner than the booking photo from 2017. His face had cuts and bruises from moving through brush. His clothes, the same dyed black materials he had spent 6 months preparing, were ripped and stained. He looked, in the photograph, less like a fugitive who had outsmarted the system and more like a man whose plan had run out about 10 days earlier than he had budgeted for. Whatever he had been telling himself in the woods about being able to last 6 months, the reality of the country and the weather and the dog teams had cut that estimate by 90%. Authorities confirmed his identity through fingerprinting. The man they had been chasing for nearly 2 weeks was, in the end, found within yards of where he had started. The post-escape investigation was, predictably, brutal for the Arkansas Department of Corrections. In August of 2025, the director of the Arkansas Division of Corrections, Dexter Payne, sat in front of a state legislative committee and dropped a bombshell. GrantHardin, he said, should never have been at the North Central Unit at all. He should have been at a higher security facility. He had been classified into a medium security population because of what the department was characterizing, at the time of the hearing, as a computer error, a misclassification that had moved a violent murderer-rapist into a category of inmate he did not belong in. How that error had happened, who had made it, and whether anyone had deliberately changed his security level inside the system was, at the time of that hearing, still under internal review. Payne told the legislators that the only way Hardin should have been at Calico Rock was if someone had gone into the system and specifically authorized it. That investigation is still ongoing. The computer error framing did not go over well with the committee. Several legislators pressed Payne on whether the misclassification was, in fact, a software glitch or whether it was the result of a human override. The director answered carefully. He acknowledged that the classification system uses a series of factors: severity of offense, length of sentence, behavior in custody, age of the inmate, and that the algorithm should have flagged Hardin for higher security. He said that the system did flag him initially. The question of what happened between that initial flag and his eventual placement at Calico Rock is, as of the time I'm putting this video together, still an open chapter of the post-escape investigation. What's also still in dispute is whether anyone is going to face professional consequences beyond the gate officer. The officer who opened the back gate, Walker, was disciplined. The department has not publicly named anyone else who has been removed or reassigned over the misclassification side of the failure. Several Arkansas state legislators have been pushing for a more comprehensive accountability review. The new Commissioner of Corrections has said in public statements that internal reform is happening on multiple fronts at the same time, but has declined to give specifics about which staff at which levels have faced what kind of action. In September of 2025, the Arkansas State Police released their own report on the escape, a 900-page document detailing everything from the kitchen materials Hardin had used to the staff member who had opened the gate. The report concluded that the breakout was the result of both careful planning by Hardin and what the state police called multiple failures by prison staff. The protocols at the back gate have been changed. Instead of opening electronically from the tower alone, now an officer has to physically go get a key and open the first gate manually before the second one can release. GrantHardin is currently being held at the Dorner Supermax prison in Gould, Arkansas. The Dorner unit is the highest security facility in the Arkansas State Corrections System. It is the kind of prison where his daily life is run on a different timetable than the one he had at Calico Rock. Locked down for the majority of his day. Monitored at a level that makes another escape attempt effectively impossible. The Dorner Supermax was built in the early 2000s specifically to handle Arkansas's most violent or escape-prone inmates. Cells are smaller. Out-of-cell time is restricted. Movement between any 2 points inside the building requires being escorted by staff. The kitchen access that Hardin used to plan his escape at Calico Rock does not exist at Dorner. Meals are delivered to inmates through a slot in the cell door. If he had any intention of trying a second breakout, the facility has been deliberately designed to make that effectively impossible. Whether he is still trying, internally, is the kind of question that corrections officials no longer answer in public. The broader Arkansas system has, since the escape, gone through what corrections analysts have called the most significant operational shakeup the state's prison system has seen in 2 decades. The Calico Rock facility itself was renamed in mid-2025. The North Central Unit, where Hardin had been held, was rechristened the Benny Magnus Unit after a long-serving Arkansas Board of Corrections member. Officials denied that the renaming was related to the escape, but the timing made it impossible to separate the two in the public mind. Several Arkansas state legislators introduced bills in the 2025 to 2026 session aimed at tightening corrections oversight. One proposal would require independent classification audits, a system in which a third-party reviewer, not the department itself, would have to sign off on any inmate being placed below the security level their offense profile would normally indicate. Another proposal would mandate yearly inventories of every contraband-eligible item in every prison kitchen across the state, from utensils to disposable equipment to, yes, markers. Whether any of these bills become law is, at the time I'm putting this video together, still pending. He has been charged with the escape itself, on top of his existing sentences. He pleaded not guilty to the escape charge. His trial on it is scheduled for November of 2025. Whether the case ends in additional years tacked onto his current sentence is, given that he is already serving 80, mostly a matter of legal record-keeping rather than practical consequence. He will not be a free man again. He turned 61 in 2026, and the math of his time means that even with the best possible parole consideration on his earliest sentence, he would be over 100 years old before any release. I want to come back to the 2 victims at the center of this case, because this story has, since the escape last May, been told mostly as a true crime curiosity. The prison break, the manhunt, the disguise, the missing markers. The earlier crimes get a paragraph each in most of the coverage. They deserve more than that. James Appleton was a 59-year-old man with a family, a job he had held for years, and a brother-in-law who happened to be on the phone with him in the seconds before he died. His family has not spoken extensively in the press. The Tillman family, after the murder, kept a low profile through the trial and the conviction. The town of Gateway has, by the accounts of locals quoted in regional newspapers, never quite recovered from the fact that the police chief they had hired turned out to be the person who would later shoot one of their own. The town is still about 400 people. They still meet at the post office. James Appleton's name is still on the city water department's old records. Amy Harrison has, since her 2019 court appearance, become a quiet but public voice for survivors of sexual assault, particularly survivors of cold cases. She has done interviews, spoken at events, and talked openly about what it took, mentally, to keep insisting that her case should not be closed and forgotten, even during the 15 years between the John Doe warrant and the DNA match. The Cold Justice television show, which had been at her case at one point, returned to do a follow-up piece after Hardin's 2019 plea. Amy spoke directly to camera. She did not, by every available account, ever change her position on what she had said at sentencing. She was not a victim, she was a survivor. The man who had attacked her was the criminal. The Rogers Police Department's John Doe warrant from 2003 has, since then, become a model for cold case sexual assault investigation across the country. Several other state prosecutors' offices have adopted similar practices since the Harrison case was cleared. In a roundabout way, what happened to Amy Harrison in a school bathroom on a Sunday morning in 1997 has, through the courage of one survivor and the patience of one police department, directly helped close other cold cases that nobody else was going to solve. There's a piece of this case I keep coming back to whenever I think about it, and I want to leave you with it rather than wrap up with a tidy moral. When GrantHardin walked out of the Gateway police chief job in 2016, after the city council told him to resign or be fired, he should have been done with law enforcement forever. The behavior the council had documented was the kind of file that, if any other employer had ever looked at it, would have been a permanent disqualification from working anywhere near vulnerable people. But that file, like a lot of small-town personnel files in rural America, did not travel with him. He went back to a corrections officer job in Fayetteville. He kept the uniform, the badge, and access to firearms. That gap, between what one institution knew about him and what the next institution along the line did not, is, in retrospect, the thing that connects every single chapter of this case. Eureka Springs PD knew something about him. Whatever they knew did not travel to the next agency. Gateway's city council knew something else. What they knew did not show up in the Fayetteville Correction Center's hiring file. The state DOC, by its own classification system, had data that should have placed him in higher security. That data, by the director's own admission, did not actually drive his placement. Every step of his life, somebody knew something. Every step, the next person down the line was working without it. 9 months after the city council told him to leave, James Appleton was dead. The prosecutor who handled Hardin's case, Nathan Smith, said something at the time of his rape conviction in 2019 that I want to give you in his own words, because it is the cleanest summary of who GrantHardin is that anyone in the legal system has ever offered. Smith said, "GrantHardin, in my view and in my personal experience, is one of the most dangerous people that I have ever seen, for the reason that he does not at first appear that way. He is a man capable of a seemingly random, horrific murder, as well as a random, horrific rape. That is the cop-turned-murderer-turned-prison escapee in a single sentence. He looks ordinary. He looks, in fact, like he might belong wherever he is, including, as the Calico Rock corrections officer would learn the hard way last May, behind the badge of an officer pushing a cart toward a back gate at 3 in the afternoon. If you stuck with me through this one, thank you. It's a strange case to sit with, partly because of who he is, partly because of how many institutions had warning signs about him for years and didn't act, and partly because the survivors at the center of the story have shown a kind of strength that, frankly, makes me feel like I'm not telling them justice in a video. If a detail from this stayed with you, the John Doe warrant from 2003 that nobody got to use for 15 years, the white car driving away in Gateway on the morning James Appleton died, the Sharpie markers that the state senator couldn't get an answer about, or the moment Walker turned to answer the phone in the control tower, leave a comment with what hit you. I read all of them. One last thing before I sign off, and it's a detail from the surveillance footage that the Department of Corrections later released. The cameras caught Hardin walking across the prison grounds in his dyed black uniform, pushing the cart, looking exactly like a man who knew where he was going. He was, in that footage, calm. He was not hurried. He did not look around. He pushed his cart in a straight line toward a gate that, in his head, he had walked through 100 times in the planning. When the gate opened in front of him, he did not break stride. He just kept walking. What I keep wondering, and what nobody at any of the legislative hearings, in any of the reports, in any of the press briefings has fully answered, is the question of when exactly GrantHardin first started thinking about the back gate. Was it the first week he worked the kitchen? The first month? Did he watch that gate every day from a yard window for years, slowly mapping the schedule of who opened it and who didn't? Did he know which corrections officer was on Sunday afternoon shift before he picked the date? The official investigation has documented the 6-month preparation period. It has not been able to pin down the moment the idea first arrived. That's the moment I think about. The single afternoon in some forgotten week, somewhere inside the routine of a model inmate's life, when a man who had already proven that he was capable of patient, methodical violence quietly looked at a gate across a prison yard and thought to himself, I could walk out of here, and then spent the next several years inside the system that was supposed to be holding him quietly building, in plain sight, the exit. So that's Hardin. Spent years hiding behind a badge, then literally escaped prison disguised as the kind of cop he used to be. Almost funny if it wasn't so dark. Our next guy didn't hide anything. He wrote it all down first. 40 names. A declaration of war on his own department. And then he made every single threat real, one by one, for 9 days straight. I mean, at one point investigators realized he'd been hiding less than a mile from their own command post the whole time, watching them search for him.
And I knew how much he loved me.
He was going to try and kill anybody who stopped him.
He is narcissistic. He is grandiose.
A cabin in the San Bernardino Mountains is on fire. Inside is a former Los Angeles police officer who has spent the last 9 days hunting his old colleagues. Outside, 300 police officers stand in the snow. across the street from where this man has been hiding for almost a week. The sheriff's department had set up the command center for the manhunt. They had been looking for him from a building he could see out his window. His name is Christopher Dorner. He's 33 years old. He's a Navy Reserve lieutenant who was honorably discharged 11 days ago. He's also the most wanted man in California, and what he did over the previous 9 days is going to make him, depending on who you ask, either the most dangerous spree killer of 2013 or, and this is the part I genuinely couldn't believe when I read it, a kind of folk hero with 24,000 followers on a Facebook page rooting for him. Let me walk you through how a man went from being one of the LAPD's own to publishing an 11,000-word document declaring war on the department, killing 4 people, and burning to death in a vacation cabin in front of millions of people watching live on cable news. Hit subscribe before we get into it. Okay? It starts on a Sunday evening. Irvine, California. February 3rd, 2013. The top floor of a parking garage at an upscale condo complex. A car is sitting there with 2 people inside. 28-year-old Monica Kwan and her fiancé, 27-year-old Keith Lawrence. They had just gotten engaged. Monica was an assistant women's basketball coach at Cal State Fullerton. She had played at Long Beach State, gone into coaching, had a master's degree, a real future. Keith was a campus police officer at USC. They had been together for years, were about to start the wedding planning, were sitting in their car probably talking about something completely ordinary. Monica had played college basketball at Cal Poly Pomona before transferring to Long Beach State. She was a 6-foot-tall point guard, fast, sharp, the kind of player who, at the small college level, made her teammates look better than they were. After her playing career ended, she had gone into coaching almost immediately. She was on the staff at Cal State Fullerton by 2012, working with the women's program, helping with recruiting, running practices. Her players, when they spoke at her memorial weeks later, used the word mentor almost every time. She had been recruited into coaching specifically because she had the patience to break down complex offensive sets and the personality to keep 19-year-olds emotionally engaged in a long season. By every account, she was good at the job. She was good at it specifically because of who she was, not because of who her father had been. Keith Lawrence had grown up in Inglewood. He had been a campus police officer at USC for several years by 2013. He had been a college basketball player himself at Concordia University in Irvine, which is how he and Monica had met. 2 basketball players who fell in love, got engaged, were planning a wedding for later in 2013. Keith's family later released a statement describing him as the kind of son who called his mother every week, the kind of brother who showed up to every family event, the kind of fiancé who had told everyone he was the luckiest man alive to be marrying a woman like Monica. They were shot to death inside that car. Multiple rounds. The shooter walked away from the parking garage in a city where, by every statistical measure, this kind of thing does not happen. Irvine, California is one of the safest cities in the United States. The Irvine Police Department had not handled a homicide of this kind in years. They had no leads, no motive, no witnesses. For 2 days, the case looked like a random tragedy. Then someone in National City, about 60 miles south of Irvine, opened a dumpster and found LAPD-issued equipment inside. A notebook in the bag had 2 names written in it. One was the name Evans. The other was Dorner. Detectives called LAPD. They were told there was no current officer named Dorner, but there had been one. He had been fired in 2008, 5 years earlier. The other name in the notebook, Evans, belonged to Sergeant Teresa Evans, the woman who had been his training officer back when he was a rookie. And there was one more name worth pulling up. Randall Kwan, Monica's father. Randall Kwan was the LAPD's first Asian American captain. He had represented Christopher Dorner at the disciplinary hearing in 2008 that ended Dorner's career as a cop. By Dorner's view of that hearing, Kwan had not represented him well enough. He had let him be fired. So Dorner, 5 years later, had not gone after Kwan himself. He had gone after Kwan's 28-year-old daughter on the top floor of a parking garage in Irvine. Once Irvine detectives understood what they were looking at, the case stopped being a random double homicide and became something else entirely. A man with police training, marksman skills, and a list of grievances was using the names of LAPD officers' family members as a target sheet. The other thing they found out very quickly was that there was a document. I want to talk about the document for a minute because it's the part of this case that, when I read it back recently, still hits differently than a normal criminal confession. 3 days before the killings, Dorner had sent a package to CNN addressed to Anderson Cooper. It arrived at Cooper's office on February 1st. Inside the package was a DVD laying out Dorner's case against the LAPD. Also inside the package was a challenge coin, one of those small commemorative medallions that police departments give out, issued by former LAPD Chief William Bratton. The coin had bullet holes through it. A handwritten note included with it read 1 minute of angle, meaning 1 minute of angle. In shooter terminology, that's the unit of measurement for accuracy at distance. Dorner had shot the LAPD's own commemorative coin from 100 yards away and put a group of holes in it the size of an inch. He was telling the news network, in advance, exactly what kind of marksman they were about to be dealing with. 3 days after that package arrived, Monica Kwan and Keith Lawrence were dead. The day after that, on February 4th, Dorner posted what he called his manifesto on Facebook. 11,400 words, addressed to America. The document was a long, rambling, fits-of-rage explanation of who had wronged him and what he intended to do about it. The core claim was this, that in 2007, while still a rookie officer, Dorner had witnessed his training officer, Teresa Evans, kick a mentally ill suspect named Christopher Gettler during an arrest. Dorner had reported the kicking. Evans had denied it. The LAPD had investigated. The Board of Rights, the department's internal disciplinary panel, had ruled against Dorner. They found that he had made up the allegation. He was fired in 2008 for filing a false report. He appealed all the way through the California court system. Every level upheld the firing. By 2010, the legal path was closed. He had spent the next 3 years stewing on it. By his own writing in the manifesto, he believed that he had been fired because he was black, because Evans was protected, because the LAPD was institutionally rotten, and because no one, including his own attorney at the disciplinary hearing, Randall Kwan, had stood up for him. The manifesto named 40 law enforcement personnel he intended to kill. It also named, explicitly, the families and spouses of officers as legitimate targets. A civil rights attorney named Connie Rice, who later reviewed the full case file on Dorner's firing as part of an external audit the LAPD commissioned in response to the killings, came to a clear conclusion. The firing, she said, had been justified. The allegations Dorner made in his manifesto were unfounded. Honestly, the hardest thing about this case isn't even the violence. It's that the man who started killing people on February 3rd was, by every available independent review, not actually a wronged whistleblower. He was a man who had lost a years-long appeal process and had decided that the people who hadn't given him what he wanted should pay with their lives. But before I get into the manhunt and what came next, I want to back up. Because the question that nobody could quite answer in the weeks after the killings, and that I find myself still asking 12 years later, is how exactly the version of Christopher Dorner that his friends and former classmates remembered turned into the man who shot up a car in a parking garage in Irvine. His friends from Southern Utah University, in interviews after the manhunt, used words that you do not normally associate with spree killers. James Usera, a former classmate, told CNN that Dorner was, quote, a guy who was approachable, had a great sense of humor, fun to be around, intelligent, good conversationalist, the kind of guy most people would want to hang out with. Usera said he had a great deal of respect for him. A neighbor in La Palma, where Dorner's mother still lived in February 2013, told reporters the family seemed like really nice people. She didn't know Dorner well, she said, but she had not pegged him as somebody capable of what he had done. He had been born on June 4th, 1979, in New York. His mother, Nancy, biracial with African American and Caucasian heritage, moved the family to California while he was very young. He grew up in Norwalk and La Palma, two adjacent suburbs in Los Angeles County, in neighborhoods that, at the time, had small black populations. His mother enrolled him at Norwalk Christian School. From 1st grade through 7th grade, by Dorner's own later account in his manifesto, he was the only black student in his classes. There's a story from that period, which he himself put in writing later in life, that I think is worth slowing down for. In first grade, another student called him a racial slur. Dorner, 6 years old, punched and kicked the kid. The principal of the school called him in. The principal swatted him for fighting. He did not, according to Dorner's account, address the slur. Just punished the black kid for defending himself. That moment is the earliest one in Dorner's manifesto, where he locates what he calls the seed of his anger against institutions. Being punished by an authority figure for responding to a wrong that the authority figure didn't care about. I am not telling you that story to excuse him. I'm telling you that story because, by Dorner's own framing, that was the template that ran through every other grievance he carried for the next 30 years. Authority figures who would not take his side. People in positions of power who, when he reported a wrongdoing, did not deal with the wrongdoing. They dealt with him. By high school, Dorner had moved through John F. Kennedy High in La Palma and then Cypress High School in Cypress, graduating in 1997. He played football. He joined the La Palma Police Department's Youth Explorer program. The program small-town police departments run to give teenagers an early taste of police work. He wanted to be a cop from the time he was about 16. In 1997, he went to college at Southern Utah University in Cedar City, Utah. He played running back on the football team for at least 2 years. He graduated in 2001 with a degree in political science. He had, by every account anyone could find, no criminal record, no disciplinary issues at the university level, no behavioral problems with teammates. The friends he made in college described, in retrospect, a smart guy with strong opinions and a sense of humor. On July 3, 2002, he received a commission as an officer in the United States Navy Reserve. This is where the timeline gets dense, and it matters, because the version of Dorner that the LAPD eventually fired was a man who had been wearing some version of a uniform almost continuously for the previous decade. He went through Navy combat and navigation training. He was first assigned to a unit at the Seal Beach Naval Weapons Station near San Diego. By 2004, he was in security roles. On August 1, 2006, he was promoted to lieutenant. He became a member of the Coastal Riverine Group, which is the part of the Navy that operates patrol craft in coastal and inland waterways. From November 2006 through April 2007, he was deployed to Bahrain, where his unit ran maritime security operations in the Persian Gulf, including protecting oil infrastructure during the height of the Iraq War. He came home from Bahrain in April 2007 with 8 military awards, including the Iraq Campaign Medal, the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, and 2 Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medals. There's a story from his Navy years that I want to give you, because it tells you something about how he saw himself before everything went wrong. In 2002, while he was in undergraduate pilot training at Vance Air Force Base in Enid, Oklahoma, Dorner and a classmate found a bag containing nearly $8,000 in cash. The money belonged to the nearby Enid Korean Church of Grace. The two of them turned the bag in to the police. When a reporter asked Dorner why, he said something I think about whenever I read about this case. He said, quote, "The military stresses integrity. There was a couple of $1,000, and if people are willing to give that to a church, it must be pretty important to them." That's the man who, 11 years later, would shoot a 28-year-old woman to death in a parking garage because of a beef with her father. His path into the LAPD started in 2005, while he was still in the Navy Reserve. He went through the police academy. He was sworn in as a probationary officer. He worked under a series of training officers as part of his break-in period. On July 18, 2007, and I want to give you this date specifically because the next 2 weeks are the entire reason this whole story exists, he and his then training officer, Sergeant Teresa Evans, responded to a call at the Doubletree Hotel in San Pedro. A man named Christopher Gettler, a schizophrenic in his 30s, was causing a disturbance. What happened during that arrest is the heart of every legal proceeding that followed. Dorner's version, which he eventually filed as a formal report 2 weeks later. Evans tasered Gettler, then kicked him in the face twice while he was on the ground and handcuffed. Evans' version, she did no such thing. Gettler himself, when investigators later interviewed him, said he had been kicked in the face by a female officer matching Evans's description. Gettler's father told investigators his son had told him the same thing. 2 weeks after the arrest, on August 1, 2007, Evans submitted a negative performance evaluation on Dorner. She identified 3 specific areas where she said he needed to improve. The exact content of those criticisms has never been publicly released, but the report was, by the LAPD's own later account, a serious enough mark on Dorner's record to potentially derail his probationary status. The next day, August 2, 2007, Dorner filed his complaint against Evans. That timing, and look, this is the part that the LAPD's Board of Rights latched onto when they ruled against him a year later, became the heart of the department's case. Dorner had not filed his complaint immediately after the arrest. He had not filed it a week later. He had filed it the day after his training officer submitted a bad performance review that threatened his career. The board concluded that the complaint was retaliatory, that Dorner had made it up to discredit Evans before she could discredit him. Even with Gettler's testimony backing him up, even with Gettler's father backing him up, the board ruled that Dorner was the one lying. He was fired in 2008. He appealed. The California court system upheld the firing in 2010. By Dorner's framing in his manifesto, the entire pyramid of failure, the board, the appeals court, his own attorney, Randall Kwan, was a coordinated effort to protect a brutal training officer at the expense of an honest probationary cop. By the LAPD's framing, he had filed a false report to save his job, gotten caught, and refused to accept the consequences. There's no clean answer here. The Gettler testimony is real. The performance review timing is also real. Both things are in the record. What Connie Rice's external audit eventually concluded, and what most independent observers have concluded since, is that the firing was legally justified by the standard of evidence the board was required to use, but that the LAPD's overall internal discipline process was, in 2008, the kind of process where uncomfortable allegations against training officers often went exactly the way Dorner's did. He lost in a system that was, on a structural level, not great at this. That doesn't make him a folk hero. It also doesn't make him a liar in the way the LAPD's official record says he is. He's somewhere in between, in the gray area that no narrative, his manifesto, the board ruling, the cable news coverage, was ever willing to live in. But Dorner himself was not willing to live in that gray area either. He chose a narrative. And on February 3rd, 2013, in an Irvine parking garage, he started enforcing it with a rifle. Once the manifesto went public on February 6th, LAPD officials understood exactly what they were dealing with. Within hours, the department set up protection details for the 40-plus named targets. They removed officers from patrol motorcycles because motorcycles offer no cover against a rifle. They positioned officers outside the homes of every person named. Thousands of officers were assigned to highways across Southern California. What they did not have was Dorner himself. He had vanished. He surfaced for the first time that same day, February 6th, in Imperial Beach, near the Mexican border. Two Navy sailors training in a parking lot said a man approached them, asked them questions, and then walked away. They didn't think much of it at the time. The next morning, when they saw the wanted photo on the news, they realized who they had just talked to. That same night, a man matching Dorner's description tried to steal a boat in San Diego. He tied up an 81-year-old man on board, then failed at the boat jacking, and left. By that point, it looked like he was trying to make a run for Mexico. The boat jacking, when you read the full account from the elderly man involved, tells you something about how Dorner was operating in those first 72 hours. The man, who later spoke to the UT San Diego newspaper, said Dorner had approached him at the Southwestern Yacht Club in San Diego with a rifle and demanded the keys to his boat. He tied him up with extension cord. He spent 20 minutes trying to figure out how to operate the vessel. He couldn't. He gave up. He left the man tied up and ran. The elderly man, on his own, freed himself and called the police. The detail that gets me is that Dorner, a Navy lieutenant with 11 years of maritime service, including a Persian Gulf deployment, apparently could not figure out how to start a civilian sailboat in 20 minutes. That tells you, I think, something important about the state he was in by then. He had been on the run for about 70 hours. He hadn't slept, by any reasonable estimate. He was making decisions that his Navy training should have made automatic, and they weren't automatic. The manhunt was already getting to him. The other thing that broke open the case in those first hours was an LAPD-issued equipment bag found in a dumpster in National City. The bag contained a notebook with two names written inside, Dorner and Evans. That single piece of trash recovered by Irvine detectives following up on a tip is the entire reason the police were able to identify their suspect on February 6th instead of February 26th. Without that bag, Dorner could have spent days more anonymously hunting people on his list before anyone connected him to the Irvine killings. Then, everything escalated. February 7th, around 1:25 in the morning, Corona, California. A man flagged down 2 LAPD officers who had been driving protection detail for one of the manifesto targets. He told them he had just spotted Dorner. The officers stopped their car. A rifle round came through their windshield. One officer's forehead was grazed. The other was missed completely. The shooter, Dorner, drove away. 20 minutes later, Riverside, California, just a few miles east. 2 more officers in a patrol car at a traffic light. Riverside police officer Michael Crane, 34, and his partner, Andrew Takias. Dorner pulled up alongside them and opened fire with a rifle. Crane was killed. Takias was severely wounded, but survived. Michael Crane was an 11-year veteran of the Riverside Police Department. He had served 2 tours in the Marine Corps before becoming a cop, Kuwait and Bahrain. He had a wife and 2 children, a 10-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter, when Dorner killed him. The detail that stuck with me when I went back through the reporting on his death. Crane had no connection of any kind to the LAPD. He had never met Christopher Dorner. He had never been involved in any disciplinary proceeding involving Dorner. He was, by every available measure, an officer of a completely unrelated department who happened to be sitting in a patrol car at a stoplight at 1:45 in the morning when a man with a rifle decided that any uniform would do. Andrew Takias, Crane's partner, was hit multiple times in both arms. He survived, but with significant nerve damage. In an interview he gave years later to ABC7, Takias described being trapped inside the squad car as the rounds came through the windshield, watching his partner die in the seat next to him, and not being able to operate his radio because both his arms had stopped working. He estimated that the ambush lasted approximately 4 seconds. Inside of a single hour, Dorner had ambushed 4 officers from 2 different departments. He was now a confirmed cop killer. Michael Crane's memorial service, held a week later in Riverside, drew approximately 8,000 mourners. Officers from across California, Nevada, and Arizona attended. The procession of police vehicles to and from the service stretched for miles. His widow Regina spoke briefly. She thanked the public for the outpouring of support and asked, in a line that has stuck with me, that her husband's name not be lost in the larger story about Christopher Dorner. She said her children's father deserved his own story, not just to be a name in someone else's manifesto. The Riverside Police Department, in his honor, retired his badge number permanently. No officer in the department will ever wear his number again. A separate memorial for Jeremiah McKay was held in San Bernardino 3 days after the cabin fire. His pipes and drums band played at his own service. Officers from his department, many of them in dress uniform with mourning bands across their badges, carried his casket. His 4-month-old son was held during the service by an aunt. His 7-year-old daughter held a folded American flag presented to her at the end of the ceremony. She was, by all accounts, the youngest formal recipient of a folded flag the department had ever seen. What happened next is the part of this story that I think people forget, and it's the part that should make anyone serious about police accountability stop and pay attention. Because in the hours after Crane's killing, the LAPD's response to the manhunt produced 2 of the most catastrophic friendly fire incidents in modern American law enforcement history. Around 5 in the morning in Torrance, California, 8 LAPD officers were on protection detail at the home of a captain named in the manifesto. A blue pickup truck slowly approached the house. The officers believed the truck was Dorner's. They opened fire. They fired more than 100 rounds into the back of the truck. Inside that truck were 2 women, Margie Carranza and her mother, Emma Hernandez. They were delivering newspapers. They were Latina, in their 50s and 70s. The truck did not actually look anything like the truck Dorner was driving. Dorner had a gray Nissan Titan. The women were in a blue Toyota Tacoma, and the women were 2 civilians on a regular pre-dawn newspaper delivery route. Carranza was shot in the back. Hernandez was hit twice. Both survived. The city of Los Angeles later paid them a settlement of $4.2 million. None of the officers who fired were charged. I want to give you one more detail about that morning, because it tells you something specific about what was happening to LAPD officers under the pressure of the manifesto. The 8 officers who fired into the Hernandez/Carranza truck did so without giving any verbal command. There was no announcement, no order for the truck to stop, no identification as police. They saw a vehicle that looked roughly similar to the wanted truck approach a manifesto target's house, and they opened fire from behind the truck. The rounds went through the truck's rear window, its tailgate, its passenger compartment. By LAPD's own internal review of the incident later, those officers were in such a state of fear that the basic verbal command protocol that exists for exactly this kind of identification check was skipped entirely. Their training had failed them in the moment. The result was 2 innocent Latina women, one of them 71 years old, shot in the back at 5 in the morning while delivering newspapers. 25 minutes after that, less than 2 blocks away, 2 Torrance police officers spotted what they also thought was Dorner's truck. They rammed the vehicle with their patrol car, then opened fire on the driver. The driver was David Perdue, a white man on his way to pick up a friend so the 2 of them could go surfing. He had no connection to the case in any way. He survived. He sued. He settled. 2 innocent people shot, 3 more rammed by police vehicles, all in a span of about 40 minutes, in a single neighborhood, by police officers chasing a man who, at the time, was nowhere near them. The thing that hit me when I went back through the case file on this part was how, on the morning of February 7th, the LAPD was simultaneously the most heavily armed institution in California and one of the most rattled. Officers were scared. Their families were targets. Every blue pickup truck on the road looked like the one Dorner was driving. The combination of fear, sleep deprivation, and the directive to defend a manifesto-named target produced, in the span of less than an hour, 2 completely separate shootings of completely innocent civilians. None of it would have happened if Dorner had not gotten the LAPD into a state of psychological collapse. None of it would have happened also if officers had not opened fire on vehicles before identifying their occupants. By 8:30 that morning, a burned-out gray Nissan Titan was found in the woods near Big Bear Lake, a ski resort area in the San Bernardino Mountains, about 100 miles east of Los Angeles. The truck matched Dorner's. The search shifted from the Mexican border area to the mountains. For 5 days after that, the manhunt focused on Big Bear, snow on the ground, sub-freezing temperatures at night. Police, FBI, U.S. Marshals, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and search and rescue teams went door to door through every cabin and rental property in the area. They flew helicopters. They used dogs. On February 10th, Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa offered a $1 million reward for information leading to Dorner's capture. Hundreds of tips came in. None of them led anywhere. The scale of that manhunt, and I want to put numbers on it because the numbers tell you how much resource the state was throwing at this, was by some counts the largest in the history of the LAPD. Approximately 200 officers were assigned specifically to the Big Bear search at peak. More than 30 separate law enforcement agencies were contributing. The U.S. Border Patrol was watching the Mexican border. The California Highway Patrol was running checkpoints on every road in and out of Big Bear. An unmanned aerial vehicle, a drone, was deployed to assist the search from the air, marking one of the first publicly confirmed uses of a domestic surveillance drone in a U.S. manhunt. The U.S. Marshal Service, which handles fugitive cases nationally, had Dorner on its top 15 most wanted list. The Department of Homeland Security had been notified at the border crossings. By the weekend of February 9th and 10th, with no sightings, no credible tips, and a burned-out truck as the only physical evidence of where Dorner had actually gone, the lead investigators were starting to seriously consider the possibility that he had walked out of the mountains entirely, maybe hitched a ride, maybe gotten across the border into Mexico, the way his manifesto had suggested he might. The search was scaled back over the weekend. Officials began to consider the possibility that Dorner had escaped the area entirely. The Big Bear Command Center, set up at a sheriff's substation in the mountains, kept running but with reduced staffing. Here's the detail that, when I learned it, made me close the laptop and just sit there for a minute. Christopher Dorner was inside a rental condo at the Mountain Vista Resort. The Mountain Vista Resort sat directly across the street from the sheriff's command center. He had been there since approximately February 6th. For 6 days, the man the entire state of California was hunting had been 100 yards from the people leading the hunt. He had a bag of carrots and a carton of milk in the refrigerator. He could watch officers come and go through the window. By the later accounting of the resort's owners, he had been watching them too, the couple who managed the property. He saw the husband shoveling snow. He knew their schedule. On February 12th, around 12:15 in the afternoon, Karen and Jim Reynolds came back to the condo to do some cleaning. The unit was supposed to be empty. They walked into the living room. Dorner came out of a back room with a gun drawn. He told them to stay calm. He told them repeatedly, Jim Reynolds quoted him later as saying it 4 or 5 times, that he didn't have a problem with them. He said he just wanted to clear his name. He bound their wrists with plastic ties, gagged them, put pillowcases over their heads. He took their purple Nissan Rogue and left. The Reynolds got free about 15 minutes later. Karen Reynolds called 911. The phone rang at a command center less than 500 feet away. The pursuit that followed was brief and chaotic. California Fish and Wildlife wardens, who happened to be in the area on the lookout for Dorner, spotted the purple Nissan on the road. Dorner crashed the Nissan, then carjacked a white pickup truck from another driver. He fired at the wardens through the truck's window. He missed. He drove on. 2 more San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputies responded to the call about the stolen vehicle. Detective Jeremiah McKay and his partner Alex Collins. Dorner ambushed them. McKay, 35 years old, a 15-year veteran, father of a 7-year-old daughter and a 4-month-old son, was killed at the scene. Collins was hit multiple times and underwent multiple surgeries but survived. Jeremiah McKay was a name that, before February 12, 2013, would have meant something only to the people who worked with him at the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. He had been a cop since he was 20. He played bagpipes in his department's pipes and drums band. There's video of him in uniform performing at a 2009 St. Patrick's Day celebration that, after his death, his family released to the public. He was, by every account from his colleagues, the kind of cop who would organize fundraisers for the families of fallen officers from other departments. The kind of cop who showed up on his off days when somebody else's funeral needed pallbearers. His 4-month-old son will never have a memory of him. His 7-year-old daughter had to be told, on the morning of February 13th, that her father had been shot at work the day before and would not be coming home. Alex Collins, his partner, was hit by Dorner's rifle rounds multiple times. According to Sheriff John McMahon, who briefed reporters the day after, Collins underwent at least 2 surgeries on February 12th and required additional surgeries afterward. He survived. In a later interview, Collins described seeing Dorner step out from behind a snow berm with the rifle raised. He estimated, like Takias before him, that the ambush itself lasted only a few seconds. Dorner then abandoned the pickup and ran into a vacant cabin in a small neighborhood called Seven Oaks. The standoff lasted about 2 hours. Sheriff's deputies set up a 3-mile perimeter. They tried tear gas. They tried verbally demanding his surrender over loudspeakers. Nothing. Eventually, they used an armored demolition vehicle to knock down the cabin's walls. Then they fired what San Bernardino Sheriff John McMahon would later describe as burner pyrotechnic tear gas canisters into the structure. These canisters are designed to produce intense heat as they release gas. In a wooden cabin, in February, with no functioning fire suppression, the predictable thing happened. The cabin caught fire. Whether the deputies intended for that to happen, or whether the fire was an accident from the use of pyrotechnic tear gas in a flammable structure, became its own controversy in the weeks that followed. Sheriff McMahon publicly stated that the fire was not set intentionally. Other observers, including some members of the press who heard the deputies' radio traffic, were less convinced. Audio recordings of police communication during the standoff, which were obtained by KCAL 9 News in Los Angeles, captured deputies saying things like "burn it down" and "effing burn this motherfucker." The sheriff's department later said those statements were either taken out of context or were not authorized commands from incident commanders. The use of pyrotechnic devices on a wooden structure was, by the department's own internal review, in line with standard operating procedure for that kind of barricaded suspect scenario. Whether SOP is appropriate in 2013 for a snowbound wooden cabin is a separate question that the review did not address. Inside the cabin, Dorner shot himself before the fire reached him. His remains, identified 2 days later through dental records, were found in the basement. The standoff was broadcast live on every cable news channel in the country. People who had never heard of Christopher Dorner watched a vacation cabin burn to the ground on national television, knowing that the man inside was about to die. The hashtag Manhunt and the Burning Cabin became one of the defining televised crime events of 2013. The reactions that followed were, frankly, the part of this case I find hardest to talk about. Because Dorner, a man who had murdered 4 people, including a 28-year-old woman in a parking garage who had no involvement in any of his grievances, became, in certain corners of the internet, a folk hero. Facebook pages with names like "We Stand with Christopher Dorner" picked up tens of thousands of followers. People who had genuine grievances against the LAPD, and there were many, including grievances about the friendly fire shootings of Carranza and Hernandez during the manhunt, were merged in the public conversation with people who actually supported Dorner's killings. Both groups were, for a few weeks, hard to distinguish in the comment sections. I have my own view on this. I think the LAPD has had real, documented, decades-long problems with internal accountability. The friendly fire shootings during the Dorner hunt are Exhibit A. I also think there is no version of this case where Christopher Dorner gets to be a folk hero. He didn't kill anyone responsible for his firing. The woman he killed in that Irvine parking garage had no involvement in his career. Her fiancé had never met him. The Riverside cop and the San Bernardino detective he ambushed worked for agencies that had nothing to do with the LAPD at all. He shot at officers from departments that didn't appear in his manifesto. He drove every law enforcement agency in Southern California into the kind of fear state that produced 2 civilian shootings within a single hour. The honest version of this story is that one institution failed him on its own terms, at the disciplinary level, in 2008. And then he chose, in 2013, to fail every other person around him on a scale that institution had nothing to do with. Both things can be true. He had real complaints. He turned them into a body count. That, honestly, is not what I would call a folk hero arc. In the months after the standoff, the LAPD did reopen its internal review of Dorner's firing. Chief Charlie Beck announced the review publicly during the manhunt, partly as an attempt to defuse the situation while Dorner was still alive. The reopened review reached the same conclusion the original Board of Rights had reached in 2008. Dorner had filed a false report. The firing stood. Connie Rice, the civil rights attorney brought in for an independent assessment, said publicly afterward that even though the firing was justified, the LAPD's internal disciplinary system had real problems with consistency and with the perception of racial bias. The Dorner case, in her assessment, was not the right example of those problems, but those problems were real, and the LAPD owed it to itself to address them. The Rice report, which was delivered to Chief Beck several months after the killings, made specific recommendations that the department has, to varying degrees, implemented in the years since. One was a change to how Board of Rights panels were composed, moving toward a system that included civilian members alongside sworn officers, reducing the perception that cops were always judging other cops. Another recommended changes to the appeal process, giving officers more time to challenge findings and more access to the underlying evidence. A third looked at how complaints against training officers were tracked. By 2025, the LAPD had implemented most of those reforms in some form. Whether they have actually changed the underlying culture that produced Dorner's firing, or whether they are paper changes that look good in annual reports, is a question that, depending on who you ask in LA, has very different answers. Sergeant Teresa Evans, Dorner's former training officer, continued working at the LAPD throughout the manhunt and after. She was at the top of his list of targets in the manifesto. During the 9 days he was at large, her family was under round-the-clock police protection. She continued to give statements through the LAPD's media office maintaining that she had never kicked Christopher Gettler, had never used excessive force, and had filed an honest performance review on a rookie cop who was failing his probationary period. She has, by every account, never spoken publicly about the case in any extensive way. She retired from the LAPD some years after the manhunt. Her current location is not publicly known and is, by deliberate choice, kept off the record. Anderson Cooper, the CNN anchor who had received the package from Dorner on February 1st, did a segment on the case during the manhunt itself. He showed the bullet-riddled challenge coin on air. He read excerpts from the DVD Dorner had sent him. He stopped short, throughout his coverage, of treating Dorner as a sympathetic figure. He said publicly during the manhunt that he had no idea why he had been chosen as the recipient of the package and that he had immediately turned everything over to the FBI. Cooper, in subsequent interviews about his own career, has cited the Dorner package as one of the eeriest pieces of mail he has ever received, a man addressing him personally, by name, from inside a planned killing spree. The 2 torrent shootings of innocent civilians during the manhunt led to lawsuits, settlements, and 0 criminal charges against any of the officers involved. The mother and daughter delivering newspapers received $4.2 million from the city of Los Angeles. The surfer was settled with separately. No officer was prosecuted. Carranza and Hernandez, the mother and daughter who had been shot delivering newspapers, both eventually recovered from their physical injuries, though Hernandez, who was 71 at the time, suffered lasting effects from the rounds that hit her. In interviews after the settlement, the women have said they do not blame individual officers as much as they blame the institutional pressure that had been put on those officers in the hours after Dorner's manifesto went public. Margie Carranza, in a 2018 interview with NBC Los Angeles, said she had never received an in-person apology from any of the 8 officers who fired on her truck. She said the settlement money was real, but it was not the same thing as accountability. David Perdue, the surfer who was rammed and shot at by Torrance officers, has been similarly low profile in the years since. His settlement amount has not been publicly disclosed. He has, by his attorney's account, suffered ongoing physical effects from the impact of the patrol car ramming his vehicle, including injuries that affected his ability to surf, which had been, before the incident, the entire reason he was on the road that morning. The reward money Mayor Villaraigosa had announced, that $1 million, became the subject of its own months-long fight over how to divide it. Eventually, a judge ruled. $800,000 went to Karen and Jim Reynolds, the couple Dorner had tied up. The rest was split between 2 other tipsters whose information had assisted the manhunt. Andrew Takias, Crane's wounded partner, was medically retired from the Riverside Police Department because of the nerve damage in his arms. In an interview years later, he spoke about the survivor's guilt of being the cop who lived when his partner died. He has spoken at police officer memorial events. He has, by every account, struggled with the question of why he survived and Michael Crane didn't, beyond the simple geometry of which side of the patrol car Dorner had aimed at first. Alex Collins, the deputy wounded at the cabin shootout, also eventually returned to limited duty after multiple surgeries. He has spoken publicly about the moment Dorner stepped out from behind the snow berm, describing the experience in a 2023 interview with ABC 7 Los Angeles as a memory that has never fully left him. He has continued working in some capacity at the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. The 40-plus law enforcement personnel named in Dorner's manifesto remained under protection details for weeks after his death, partly because remains had not yet been positively identified, partly because the department wanted to be sure there were no associates or copycat threats still active. By the end of February 2013, those protection details were drawn down. Most of the named officers continued in their LAPD careers. Some on background told reporters that they had not entirely shaken the experience even a decade later. Knowing your name is on a public list of people somebody wants to murder is, by every account from the officers who lived through it, the kind of thing that does not fully leave you. On February 16, 2013, 4 days after the cabin fire, a protest took place outside LAPD headquarters in downtown Los Angeles. The protesters were not, by any honest reading of the crowd, supporting Dorner's killings. They were protesting the LAPD's handling of his disciplinary case, the friendly fire shootings during the manhunt, and the tactics that had been used to set the cabin on fire. The crowd was modest in size, a few hundred people. But the fact that it existed at all, 4 days after a man named in that department's manifesto list had been killed in a burning cabin, said something specific about where LAPD's standing with parts of Los Angeles community was in early 2013. The department's own internal data, released years later, showed that public trust in LAPD across Black and Latino communities took a measurable hit in the months following the Dorner case and was still recovering partially when the George Floyd protests of 2020 produced a separate, larger national reckoning. Karen Reynolds, in her press conference the day after the cabin fire, said something I keep coming back to. She had been asked whether she felt any satisfaction that the man who had bound her, gagged her, and stolen her car was now dead. She said, quote, "I didn't wish him dead, though." Her husband Jim said something similar. Throughout the few minutes they were tied up in their own living room, they later said, Dorner had been calm. He told them he was not going to hurt them. He said he could tell they were good people, hard-working people. He was polite, in the way you are not supposed to be capable of being polite when you have spent the previous 9 days hunting human beings. That contrast between the man who tied up the Reynolds couple and the man who shot Monica Kwan in a parking garage is the part of Christopher Dorner that I think will never fully resolve. He was not a typical spree killer. Before any of this happened, he had been a Navy lieutenant, a college graduate, a man who in 2002 returned $8,000 in cash he had found to a Korean church because, in his words at the time, the military stresses integrity. He had passed a polygraph during his LAPD hiring process. By every account from people who knew him before 2008, he was the man with the smile. And then he wasn't. And then he killed 4 people whose only connection to his anger was that they had names he could find on a list. If you stuck with me through this one, thank you. It's a strange case to sit with because of how many separate questions it forces, and because none of the people who actually deserve to be alive at the end of it are. Monica Kwan was 28, Keith Lawrence was 27, Michael Crane was 34 with 2 children, Jeremiah McKay was 35 with a 4-month-old son who will never have a memory of his father. Randall Kwan, Monica's father, the retired LAPD captain who Dorner had blamed for not defending him at the 2008 Board of Rights hearing, has, in the years since his daughter's death, kept almost entirely out of the public eye. He gave one brief statement in the days after Monica was killed, thanking the public for their condolences and asking for privacy. He has not, by every account I could find, given a sit-down interview in the 12 years since. His daughter's name is on a basketball court at Cal State Fullerton now, dedicated in her memory. The Kwan family asked, when the dedication ceremony happened, that her name be associated with her coaching career, not with the case that ended it. The Mountain Vista Resort, where Dorner had hidden for 6 days, was eventually sold by the Reynolds family. They have spoken less in public since the immediate aftermath of the standoff. The cabin in Seven Oaks where Dorner died was, by 2014, completely demolished. The property is now privately owned and the foundation has been removed. There is, by deliberate choice, no plaque or marker at the site. Officials in San Bernardino County have said in the past that they did not want the site to become a destination for either folk hero supporters of Dorner or for true crime tourists. The trees have grown back over the spot. There is nothing left there to indicate to a hiker walking past that one of the most watched standoffs in modern American history ended in those woods. A BC7 in Los Angeles produced a true crime documentary on the 10-year anniversary of the case in 2023 called The Manhunt for Christopher Dorner. The documentary interviewed Andrew Takius for the first time on camera, included previously unreleased radio traffic from the cabin standoff, and revisited the friendly fire shootings of Carranza, Hernandez, and Purdue. The reaction to the documentary was, by the comments under it online, the same as the reaction to the original case had been. Some viewers said the LAPD's behavior during the manhunt was unforgivable. Others said the LAPD had been in an impossible situation chasing a trained Navy lieutenant with a rifle through their own neighborhoods. Both groups were right about parts of it. Neither was completely right about all of it. If a detail from this case stayed with you, the challenge coin sent to CNN, the 6 days Dorner spent watching the command center from a condo across the street, the calm with which he tied up the Reynolds couple, the $4.2 million settlement for the women who were delivering newspapers, leave a comment with what hit you. I read all of them. One last detail before I sign off. When investigators went back through the timeline of the Reynolds couple's 6 days at the Mountain Vista Resort, they realized something about Dorner's choice of hideout that I don't think he fully thought through. The sheriff's command center across the street had been operating 24 hours a day. Lights, police vehicles, helicopter activity, search teams coming and going around the clock. Anyone hiding in that condo would have heard all of it, constantly. He had been listening to the people hunting him for 6 straight days. He could have walked away. He didn't. He just watched and waited until he ran out of time. Dorner went after the people who fired him. At least there's a logic to that, twisted as it is. This last case doesn't really have that. No badge, no manifesto, just a guy who used trust to get through a door that should have stayed locked. And what happened in the next 20 minutes is the reason this case still gets talked about. The only reason we even know the details is because one kid in that room was smart enough and brave enough to play dead.
A jury found Ronald Haskell guilty of killing 6 members of his ex-wife's family.
4 of them just children.
A 15-year-old girl, the only survivor.
A 15-year-old girl crawls across the floor of her own living room in a quiet suburb north of Houston. She has been shot in the head. The bullet grazed her skull and fractured the bone, but it didn't go in. She has been playing dead for the past few minutes, eyes closed, completely still, with 7 members of her family motionless around her. She waits until she's sure the man who did this has driven away. Then she gets up, walks across the room, and finds a phone. Her name is Cassidy Stay. The 911 call she is about to make, with a fractured skull and blood running down her face, will save her grandparents' lives within the next 20 minutes. It will end the largest single-family killing in modern Harris County history. And the man she is about to identify by name to the dispatcher is, in her words on the call, her ex-uncle. He is also one of the most thoroughly documented spouse and child abusers in the state of Utah, who had been told for 6 years by social workers, judges, and his own family that what he was doing to his wife and children was unacceptable. None of those warnings produced any meaningful consequence. The protective orders that should have caged him in had been dismissed in mutual restraining order agreements. The criminal charges that should have stuck had been pleaded down. His ex-wife had eventually given up on the system entirely and moved her children 1,800 miles across the country to live near her sister and her sister's family in Texas. A small Mormon family in a quiet subdivision called Enchanted Oaks, on a street called Leaflet Lane. He had spent 2 days driving around Spring, Texas, looking for her. She wasn't there. Her sister's family was. His name is Ronald Lee Haskell, Jr., and what I want to walk you through today is how a domestic violence case in Utah, which the system had every chance to stop, traveled across 2,000 miles and ended on a Wednesday afternoon in July of 2014 in a living room belonging to people who had only ever tried to help. The point is the story, not the violence. Let me introduce you to the Stay family first, because every news article about this case talks about Haskell. Almost none of them spend more than a paragraph on the people he killed. Stephen Robert Stay was 39 years old. He ran a real estate business in the greater Houston area. He had moved his family from California to Texas in 2012, looking for a better cost of living and to be closer to extended family. His wife, Katie Stay, was 34. She was a stay-at-home mother who, by every account from friends and neighbors interviewed in the days after, was the heart of her social circle. The one who organized birthday parties, brought food to new neighbors, knew which kid in the church congregation needed an extra ride to scout meetings. They had been married for 18 years by the summer of 2014. They were practicing members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They had 5 children. Stephen, before the real estate business, had worked in finance and project management. He had a reputation, by every account from former colleagues, for being meticulous, almost annoyingly organized, the kind of guy who showed up to meetings 10 minutes early and color-coded his folders. His move into real estate had been a deliberate career pivot in his early 30s. He wanted to be his own boss. He wanted control of his own schedule. He wanted, by his wife's later quoted statement to a friend, to be home for dinner with his kids every single night. He had built the business with that priority. By the summer of 2014, it was working. Stephen was, on most days, home before 6 o'clock. Cassidy, 15, was the oldest. Quiet, smart, the kind of teenager who already had a younger sibling sensibility about her. Patient, observant, the one her siblings went to first when something was bothering them. Brian was 13, Emily was 9, Rebecca was 7. Zach, the baby of the family, was 4 years old. The household, by the accounts of neighbors in Enchanted Oaks, was loud in the way large families are loud. Bicycles in the driveway, kids spilling out the front door on summer afternoons, Stephen coming home from the office and rolling around with the younger ones on the carpet, Katie running a tight ship with 5 kids under 16 and somehow making it look easy. The neighbors did not, in the year and a half the Stays had been in the neighborhood, hear any unusual sounds from inside the house. There was no fighting. There were no domestic disturbances. The Stays were, in the language of the people who lived next to them, just good people. They had also, in the previous year, quietly become the support network for Katie's sister. Katie's sister was named Melanie K. Lyon. She was Ronald Haskell's now ex-wife. She and her 4 children had moved to Texas in 2013, around the time her divorce was being finalized, because she needed to put serious physical distance between herself and the man she had been married to. The Stays had taken her in. They helped her find housing nearby, introduced her to the local church congregation, and made sure her 4 kids, Haskell's own children, could grow up around their cousins in a household where domestic violence was not a daily routine. I want to be careful here because the temptation in a case like this is to make the victims into saints. The Stays were not saints. They were a regular American family. They had bills and orthodontist appointments and back-to-school shopping lists. What set them apart, if anything, was that when Melanie showed up in the spring of 2013 with 4 kids and a story about what her husband had been doing to her for nearly a decade, they did not say, "Go work it out." They said, "Come live near us." That decision, 2 years later, would put 6 of them in a living room together on the wrong Wednesday afternoon. Now let me back up and tell you about the man. Ronald Lee Haskell Jr. was born on August 26, 1980. He grew up partly in San Marcos, California, and partly in Eagle River, Alaska, a small town just outside Anchorage. He went to Chugiak High School in Alaska and graduated in 1999. The detail that has stuck with me from his high school years, because of what came later, is that his classmates voted him class clown and king of both prom and homecoming. The popular kid, the funny one, the guy everyone liked. After high school, he eventually moved back down to California, worked in a few jobs that didn't lead anywhere in particular, and in 2002, at age 21, he married a young woman named Melanie K. Lyon. The wedding was on March 15, 2002, in Orange County, California. By the time they were both in their mid-20s, they had moved to Logan, Utah, which is in the northern part of that state near the Idaho border. Logan is a college town. It is also heavily Mormon, which matters here because both Haskell and Melanie were members of the LDS Church, and a lot of their social life ran through their congregation. They had 4 children together over the next several years. By all outside appearances during this period, the appearance neighbors and church members saw, they looked like a normal young Mormon family, husband working, wife at home with the kids, Sunday services every week. In Logan, Haskell worked a series of jobs over the years. He was a parcel delivery driver for the FedEx contractor mentioned earlier. He worked in retail. He had a stretch as a dance instructor at a local studio, which, given what happened later, becomes one of the strange small details of the case. By every account from people who knew him professionally during this period, he was charming, easy to talk to, funny. The same qualities that had gotten him voted class clown at Chugiak High School in Alaska were still serving him as an adult. Co-workers who later spoke to journalists described being shocked when the news of the killings broke. The Ron Haskell they had known was not the Ron Haskell of the indictment. The reality inside the house was different. By Melanie's later testimony at trial in 2019, the abuse had started early in the marriage and had escalated steadily over the years. Verbal first, then physical, then constant. She testified that Haskell physically abused her and the children, that the family lived in a state of low-grade fear most days that could turn into outright violence on any given night. The pattern, by her detailed courtroom account, was the pattern that family violence researchers have cataloged in thousands of similar cases. Periods of relative calm, then a triggering event, a job loss, a financial problem, a disagreement over the children that would set off an episode. The episode would end. He would apologize. He would promise that this time was different. Things would be calm for a few weeks. Then another trigger, another episode. The cycle repeated, by her testimony, for years. The children grew up inside it. The 2 oldest, by 2013, were old enough to remember significant violence in the household. The younger 2, at 4 and 6, had only ever known a household where their father was unpredictable. The first time the abuse made it into a public record was June of 2008. There was an incident in their home in Utah where, according to the police report later, Haskell dragged Melanie out of bed by her hair and struck her on the side of her head in front of their children. The youngest child at the time was a toddler. Melanie called the police. Haskell was arrested. He was charged with domestic violence, simple assault, and committing an act of violence in the presence of children. His version, when interviewed by investigators, was that he had only pushed her. The case went through the standard Utah misdemeanor pipeline. Haskell eventually pleaded guilty to the simple assault charge and not guilty to the domestic violence charge. A plea deal was reached. The charges were dismissed. He walked out of court with effectively no record. By every available account, he was not required to attend a serious anger management program, he did not have his access to firearms restricted in any meaningful way, and Child Protective Services did not open a sustained case on the household. This is the part of the timeline that, when I went back through it, I found the most frustrating. Because the Utah system in 2008 had, on paper, a domestic violence response framework that should have flagged this exact pattern. A dragged-by-the-hair physical attack on a spouse in front of small children is, in domestic violence research, one of the strongest predictors of future homicide. Risk assessment tools that police departments across the country were starting to adopt would have, on a basic checklist, flagged Haskell as a high-risk offender by 2008. None of that happened in his case. He pleaded down. He went home. The marriage continued for another 5 years. What I keep thinking about reading the records is the version of this story where Utah law enforcement had taken the 2008 case seriously, where the conviction had stuck, where Haskell had served real jail time, gone through actual rehabilitation programming, been on the kind of supervision that flags violations early. 6 people in a Texas living room are alive in that version. They are not alive in the version where the system did what it actually did, which was let him plead down to a single misdemeanor and disappear. In July of 2013, Melanie filed a protective order against him. The order was served the day after she filed it. About a month later, she filed for divorce. The protective order was, in October of 2013, dismissed because the Haskells' divorce attorneys had agreed to a mutual restraining order as part of the custody arrangement, which is a common Utah practice that essentially merges the protective order into the divorce paperwork. By the time the divorce was finalized, Melanie had primary custody of all 4 children. She moved them to Texas to be near her sister. She did not, by every account I could find, tell Haskell where exactly she was going. He found her anyway, or rather, he found her general direction. He knew she had family in the Houston area. He knew her sister Katie lived in a suburb north of the city. He didn't have her address, but he knew her sister's, because Katie had been part of the family for almost 2 decades, and they had visited her in Texas before. In early July of 2014, Ronald Haskell got in his car in California, where he had been living since the divorce with his parents, and drove to Texas. By the prosecution's later account at trial, the drive took him 2 days. He arrived in the Spring area around the 7th or 8th of July. He spent the next 48 hours stalking, driving past the stay house multiple times, sitting in his car at a distance, trying to figure out who was inside, when they were inside, and whether his ex-wife might be visiting. The car he was driving was a small red sedan he had rented in California specifically for the trip. Inside it, when officers later inventoried the contents after his arrest, they found a handgun, multiple boxes of ammunition, plastic zip ties, duct tape, a baseball cap, the components of the delivery driver outfit he would wear, energy drinks, fast food wrappers from the previous 2 days, and a printed list of addresses. The list, by the prosecution's later presentation at trial, was the heart of the premeditation argument. It was a written hit list. Katie Stay's address, the grandparents' address on Anvil Drive, the address of Melanie's brother, and the address Melanie herself had been living at, which Haskell apparently had not been able to confirm. The order of the addresses was significant. The Stays were at the top because, by Haskell's logic, somebody at that house would know where his ex-wife was and would tell him. He had a phone with him, too. By the cell tower records pulled after his arrest, he had used the phone repeatedly during those 48 hours to call relatives back in California, his brother, his mother, having what those relatives later described at trial as long, rambling conversations. He had also made multiple calls to a Mormon bishop he had known back in Utah, who later testified that the conversations were not coherent. The bishop did not, by his own admission later, alert anyone about what Haskell was saying. He thought it was an emotional crisis that would pass. It did not pass. She wasn't there. She was at her own home in another part of the Houston suburbs with her 4 kids. The Stays did not know that Haskell was within 500 miles of their address. I want to give you the detail about the disguise because it matters. Years before any of this happened, Haskell had worked as a parcel delivery driver. The specific arrangement was that he had been employed by an independent contracting company that, in turn, had a contract with FedEx. He had stopped working in that role in January of 2014, 6 months before he drove to Texas. But he still had the muscle memory of a delivery uniform and the language of a delivery driver, and the visual instinct of a regular American family who sees somebody at the door in brown clothes with a clipboard as to open the door. He wore something approximating delivery uniform clothing on the afternoon of Wednesday, July 9th, 2014. Black pants, a button-up shirt, a baseball cap. He carried what looked like a clipboard or a package, anything that would, in a 90-second front door interaction, read as routine. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, he rang the bell at 711 Leaflet Lane. Cassidy Stay, 15 years old, answered the door. She did not recognize the man on her porch. She had not seen her Uncle Ron in years, possibly not since she had been quite young, and the version of him standing in the doorway in delivery uniform clothes did not click in her memory as a relative. He asked for her parents. She said they weren't home. They had stepped out for an errand. She closed the door. He left. I want you to picture for a second what was happening in Haskell's head at that exact moment. Because he had just been at the door of the house he had been planning to enter, and he had been told that his targets were not present. A different kind of person, someone for whom this was not premeditated, might have walked away from the porch, sat in their car, second-guessed themselves, driven home. Haskell did not do that. He sat in his car at a distance. He waited. About 15 minutes later, the Stay family vehicle pulled into the driveway. Stephen, Katie, and the 4 younger children, returning from wherever they had been. They went inside. Haskell drove back. He rang the bell again. This time, when Cassidy opened the door, he told her he was her ex-uncle. There is no full transcript of exactly what was said in the next 30 seconds. But by Cassidy's testimony at trial 5 years later, she tried to close the door on him. He pushed his way in. He had a handgun. He demanded that everyone in the house get down on the floor. What happened over the next 20 minutes inside 711 Leaflet Lane is, by every standard of journalism I try to hold myself to, not something I'm going to walk you through in detail. There are children involved. The youngest was 4. The family was bound. Haskell demanded repeatedly that they tell him where his ex-wife was, Melanie, Katie's sister, and they either could not or would not. They were forced face down on the living room floor. They were each shot, one by one, in the back of the head. 5 of them died at the scene. A 6th died at the hospital shortly after. Cassidy, the oldest child, was last. The bullet grazed the side of her head, fractured the bone, but did not enter her skull. She passed out for a moment. When she came back to herself, she stayed completely still. She didn't make a sound. Haskell, by the prosecution's reconstruction at trial, walked through the rooms of the house looking for anything that might tell him where Melanie was living. He took the family's car keys. He went out, got into the Stay family's vehicle, and drove away. Cassidy waited until she was sure he was gone. Then she got up. She had been shot in the head. Her skull was fractured. She was bleeding. She walked across the living room, past her family, to a phone. She dialed 911. The 911 dispatcher who took her call has, in the years since, been quoted as saying she had never received a call quite like it before. The caller's voice was steady. The information she gave was specific. She identified herself by name. She identified the suspect by name, my ex-uncle, Ron Haskell. She said he had just shot her family, taken their car, and had been asking about her Aunt Melanie. Then she told the dispatcher she believed he was driving next to her grandparents' house on Anvil Drive, Melanie's parents, to do the same thing to them. She gave the dispatcher the grandparents' address. That detail saved their lives. Within minutes of the 911 call, deputies from the Harris County Sheriff's Office and Constable Mark Herman's precinct had been dispatched both to the Stay residence and to the grandparents' house. By the constable's later account, his K-9 unit had been at a fire station only minutes from Anvil Drive on a separate matter. He pulled them off the call and sent them to the grandparents' address. They arrived in time. The grandparents, Roger and Sandra Lyon, in their 70s, were home. By the constable's quote later, they had no idea that a man was on his way to kill them. The deputies told them what was happening, got them out of the house, and waited. Haskell never made it to Anvil Drive. About 4 miles into his drive, sheriff's deputies began following him in unmarked units. A spike strip was deployed across the road ahead of him. His tires deflated. He kept driving slowly, the rims scraping the pavement, until he turned into a residential cul-de-sac about 3 miles from the stay house. There he stopped. 2 armored vehicles, an MRAP, which is a military-grade mine-resistant patrol vehicle, and a tactical Bearcat, pulled in front of and behind his car, blocking him in completely. I want to give you a detail about that chase that doesn't always make it into the reporting. By the time the chase ended, approximately 20 Harris County Sheriff's patrol cars were involved. The neighborhood around the cul-de-sac was a quiet residential subdivision. Deputies evacuated nearby homes during the standoff. Residents from several blocks in either direction were told to shelter in place, then later were moved to a community center while the situation was active. The whole afternoon, from Cassidy's 911 call to Haskell's surrender, was approximately 5 hours of active emergency response across the northern Harris County area. Television helicopters were filming overhead. By the time the standoff was finally resolved, the cul-de-sac scene had been broadcast live on every Houston TV station. The standoff that followed lasted about 3 hours. Haskell stayed inside the car. He held the handgun he had used in the killings against his own head for portions of it. He communicated with SWAT negotiators over his cell phone. By the audio recordings that were later played at trial, his voice on those calls was, at times, almost matter-of-fact. At other times he was agitated. At one specific point, he told the negotiators, in a quote that would later become the centerpiece of his defense team's insanity strategy, "I'm not coming out. I'm not going to jail. I'm just not right in the head. Like I can't think right." He asked to speak with his brother and his parents. Around 10 o'clock that night, after 3 hours of negotiation, he opened the car door, got out, fell to his knees, and surrendered. The cul-de-sac was full of officers with rifles trained on him. He was taken into custody without further incident. In the hospital, Cassidy's stay was stabilized. She had a fractured skull. She had post-traumatic injuries from the bullet. She had, by the medical team's later account, walked into the ER under her own power, the bullet wound on her temple, blood on her face, her family's blood on her clothing, asking the people treating her if her grandparents were okay. She was told they were. She did not, in those first hours, ask about her parents or her siblings. By a later interview with the family pastor, Cassidy had already understood inside the living room that they were gone. She had not needed anyone to tell her. The first 48 hours of her hospital stay were focused on stabilizing the skull fracture and managing the traumatic brain injury risk that comes with any head wound, even a graze. She was, by the doctor's later account, an unusually composed patient for a teenager who had been through what she had been through. She slept. She ate when she was told to eat. She did the standard neurological assessments. The hospital staff, who had been told who she was as soon as her name went into the system, mostly tried to give her privacy. Local Houston television crews staked out the parking lot for days. Her grandparents, Roger and Sandra Lyon, stayed in the hospital with her around the clock. She was discharged about a week later. By that point, her face on television had become one of the most recognizable images in the Houston area. The GoFundMe campaign her aunt Aubrey Westwood had set up online had already crossed $200,000. National news anchors had flown in. There was a memorial service in the planning, and Cassidy, 15 years old, walked out of the hospital wearing a baseball cap to cover the wound, with her grandparents on either side of her, into a media scrum she had not asked for and would not, by every later account, ever fully escape. A funeral for the Stay family, Stephen and Katie and the 4 children, was held 2 weeks after the killings at a Latter-day Saint chapel in Spring, Texas. The service drew over 1,000 mourners, including community members who had never personally known the family, who came simply because they could not imagine not showing up. Cassidy spoke briefly. Her statement, by every account, was steady. She thanked the community for their support. She said her family had loved Jesus Christ and had loved each other. She did not, in that public statement, mention her Uncle Ron by name. The service was carried live on local Houston television. The trial, when it eventually happened, took 5 years to begin. Haskell's case was reset on the court docket approximately 20 times between 2014 and 2019. Some of those resets were standard procedural delays. Others were the result of his defense team's lengthy effort to build the insanity case they would eventually present. Under Texas law, an insanity defense requires the defense to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that the defendant, at the time of the offense, did not know that what he was doing was wrong because of a mental disease or defect. It is a high bar. Texas has one of the strictest insanity standards in the country. The specific reasons for the 20 resets when I went back through the court filings are a useful illustration of how slowly the American capital murder process actually moves. Some delays were because the defense team had to retain and consult with multiple forensic psychiatrists, each of whom needed time to interview Haskell in the Harris County Jail and prepare reports. Others were because the prosecution had to respond with its own retained experts. A third category involved legal motions over whether certain evidence could be presented to the jury, including parts of Haskell's recorded jail communications. And several months were eaten up by procedural protections around Cassidy Stay, who was the prosecution's central witness. She was a minor for the first several years of the case, and her testimony required special handling. The state of Texas, by 2018, was holding Haskell in solitary confinement at the Harris County Jail, partly for his own safety from other inmates, and partly because of his own behavior with jail staff. Throughout this entire pretrial period, the Stay family, Cassidy, the grandparents, the extended family, waited. Doug Durham, one of Haskell's court-appointed attorneys, built the defense around a forensic psychiatrist who testified that Haskell suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. The core claim was that Haskell heard voices that told him to kill the Stay family, that he genuinely believed those voices were real and authoritative, and that he could not, in the moment, distinguish right from wrong. The prosecution, led by Harris County prosecutors Kaylin Williford and Samantha Necht, ran an opposite case. Their experts testified that Haskell was not actually mentally ill in the legal sense. He had faked the symptoms. The killings, by their reconstruction, were meticulously planned. Haskell had traveled across multiple state lines, disguised himself, stalked the residents for 2 days, and selected a method that would allow him to control multiple people at once. During the attack itself, he asked his victims specific questions about his ex-wife, a behavior inconsistent with someone driven by delusion. Afterward, he reloaded the gun and headed toward his next target, and during the standoff, his 3-hour phone negotiation with police was, by their reading, the kind of conversation that indicated full awareness of his legal situation, including asking for his family. The jury heard both versions over a 6-week trial in August and September of 2019. Cassidy Stay testified. She was 20 years old by then. She took the witness stand and described, in measured language, what had happened in her living room 5 years earlier. She described begging her uncle, in the moments before he opened fire, with the words, "Please don't hurt us." Multiple jurors, by the later accounts of reporters in the courtroom, were openly crying during her testimony. Cassidy's testimony covered close to 2 full days of court time. She walked the jury through the front door interaction. She walked through the moment she realized the man in delivery clothing was her uncle. She described being forced to lie face down on the living room floor with her younger siblings. She described the questions Haskell asked the family about where her Aunt Melanie lived, and the moment she understood that nobody in the room had the answer he wanted. She described, in the most measured way she could, what she saw and heard before she was shot. She described playing dead. When the prosecution asked her how she had been able to get up after Haskell left, given the head wound she had sustained, she answered simply that she had not really thought about it at the time. She had known that her grandparents were on his list, known the address, known she needed to reach a phone before he reached their house. The mathematics of the situation, by her testimony, had not allowed for any other choice. By every account from reporters in the courtroom during her testimony, the defense's cross-examination of Cassidy was relatively brief. Doug Durham did not, by every later account, want to be the defense attorney who was seen pressing the survivor of a child massacre too hard in front of a Texas jury. He asked her a few clarifying questions about details of the timeline and the layout of the house. He thanked her in front of the jury for testifying. He sat down. Haskell did not take the stand in his own defense. On September 26, 2019, the jury came back. 8 hours of deliberation over 2 days. Guilty of capital murder on the deaths of Stephen and Katie Stay, the only 2 charges the prosecution had needed to file to reach a capital conviction, because the legal strategy in Texas is to charge selectively, in case a court of appeals later finds issues with one count. The insanity defense was rejected. The punishment phase began the following week. Under Texas law, the jury had two options for a capital murder conviction: life in prison without the possibility of parole, or death by lethal injection. The jury had to determine, in order to impose the death penalty, that Haskell would pose a continuing threat to society and that mitigating factors, including any genuine mental illness, were not sufficient to merit a lesser sentence. The defense, in its closing argument, asked for life without parole. Doug Durham told the jury that Haskell had a long history of treatment by multiple doctors, that his mental health diagnoses were real, even if jurors had rejected the legal version of insanity, and that the appropriate punishment was for him to spend the rest of his life thinking about what he had done. He used the phrase, "die in prison." His co-counsel Neil Davis III made a similar argument. The prosecution made the opposite case. Prosecutor Samantha Knecht told the jury in closing that this was the moment for justice for the Stay family. Prosecutor Kaylin Williford walked through what Haskell had done to each victim individually, including describing how he had pointed a gun at the back of the head of a 4-year-old. By later accounts from the courtroom, at least one juror was wiping away tears as she spoke. The jury deliberated for slightly more than 4 hours. On October 11, 2019, they returned with a sentence of death. Cassidy Stay, who had been in the courtroom for the verdict, immediately afterward took the witness stand one more time. She addressed her family's killer directly. She told him she no longer worried about whether he would feel remorse. She said, in her own words quoted in every news report from the day, "I hope that when you die, you will get the punishment you deserve from God." She walked out of the courthouse with her grandparents. Ronald Haskell was transferred to the Polunsky Unit, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice facility in Livingston, Texas, that houses the state's death row. Like every death row inmate in Texas, he is on a single-cell, 22 hours a day lockdown regimen. He has been on death row since October 2019. Texas's appellate process for death sentences is, by design, slow. The direct appeal of his conviction and sentence is, as of the time I'm putting this video together, still working through the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. After that, depending on the outcome, there will be a federal habeas process. Realistic timelines for execution after a Texas death sentence are typically a decade to 15 years from the initial sentence, though the variance is wide. Some Texas inmates have been executed within 7 years. Others have been on death row for more than 30. What life looks like for Haskell at Polunsky, day to day, is the routine the unit was specifically designed to enforce on its death row population. He is in a cell that is approximately 60 square feet. There is no television. Reading material is limited and screened. He gets about an hour of recreation per day in a separate caged area, usually alone. Visits are non-contact, behind glass. He communicates with his attorneys by letter and limited phone calls. The Texas death row regime is, by every academic study of solitary confinement, one of the harshest in the United States, and human rights organizations have been calling for its reform for years. None of those reform efforts have, to date, materially altered the conditions Haskell currently lives under. Haskell is, by his own legal team's account, still committed to the insanity defense as an issue on appeal. Whether the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reaches a different conclusion than the original jury did is, by every available analysis, unlikely. The trial record was solid. The prosecution's experts had clean credentials. The defense did not produce a smoking gun document or witness that the appeals court might find a jury had improperly disregarded. The most likely outcome, in the view of appellate observers, is that the conviction and sentence will be affirmed at the state level. The federal habeas process will run its course, and at some point in the late 2020s or early 2030s, Texas will set an execution date. His own family, including the brother who testified at the trial's punishment phase that Ron still has good in him, has, by every account, continued to support him through the appellate process. They visit him at Polunsky on the schedule the unit allows. They write him letters. They have not, by every public statement they have given, ever publicly accepted the jury's verdict that he was not legally insane. That family disagreement, between the Stays, the Lyons, and Cassidy on one side, and Haskell's parents and brother on the other, is the kind of family fracture that, in cases like this, never gets repaired. Cassidy Stay is, as of the most recent publicly available information, in her late 20s. She has, in the years since the killings, gone to college. She has spoken at events for survivors of domestic violence and family violence. She has remained close with her grandparents, Roger and Sandra Lyon, who, by every account, are the closest thing she now has to immediate family. Her Aunt Melanie, Haskell's ex-wife, who Cassidy's parents had sheltered in 2013, has continued to live in the Houston area with her own 4 children. Those 4 children, Haskell's own kids, lost their aunts, uncles, and 4 cousins on a single Wednesday afternoon. They will spend the rest of their lives knowing that their father is the reason. She gave one major sit-down interview to ABC News about a year after the trial. By her own description in that interview, she had not slept through a full night for years after the killings. The interviewer asked her how she had managed to keep going. Her answer was, by every account, religious in nature. She said her faith was the thing that had carried her, that the certainty her family was still with her in some form had kept her on her feet through the early years. She did not, in that interview, present herself as a spokesperson for any specific advocacy cause. She presented herself as a person trying to live a life worth her family's memory. Roger and Sandra Lyon, Cassidy's grandparents, took on the role of raising her after the killings, when she still had years of high school left. Roger Lyon, who had been Haskell's father-in-law for over a decade, gave a brief public statement in the days after the murders. He thanked the public for praying. He said he and his wife were in awe of Cassidy's bravery. He did not mention Haskell by name. In the years since, the Lyons have, by every account, kept a low profile. They have been to court for hearings. They sat with Cassidy during the trial and the sentencing. They have not, by every search I could run, given any extensive media interviews. They have, by every available account, raised their granddaughter as the second family they did not expect to have to build. The GoFundMe campaign that was set up for Cassidy in the days after the killings raised more than $406,000 from over 16,000 individual donors. The money went into a trust for her medical care, education, and long-term living expenses. The community in Spring, Texas, rallied around the Stay family in a way that, by every later account, made a real practical difference in Cassidy's ability to recover and rebuild. A dance studio in the Houston area was later named in honor of one of the Stay children, who had been taking dance lessons before her death. The Latter-day Saint community in the Houston area, which had been the social anchor for both the Stay family and Melanie's family, took on a long-term role in supporting the surviving relatives. By a 2019 interview, a local Mormon bishop gave to the Salt Lake Tribune, members of the congregation had organized meal trains for the Lyons and Cassidy for years after the killings. The community covered therapy costs. They handled transportation. They paid for Cassidy's transition to college. The response, by every account, became one of the case's quiet bright spots, a network of practical, sustained help that did not show up in the news cycle, but that, for the surviving family members, was the actual mechanism by which they continued to function. The house at 711 Leaflet Lane was eventually sold, and the family moved on. The Enchanted Oaks subdivision is still a quiet, middle-class community in Spring. Most of the neighbors who lived on Leaflet Lane in 2014 have since moved away, partly because of property turnover, partly because some of them, by their own statements to local reporters years later, could not stay on a street where what had happened had happened. The house itself has changed hands more than once. The current owners, by every available record, did not know the history when they bought it. Whether they know now is between them and their realtor. I want to come back to the question I started with, because the question this case forces, and it's a question I do not think anyone has fully answered, is what would have happened if the system had taken the 2008 Utah domestic violence arrest seriously. The Utah misdemeanor pipeline that processed Ronald Haskell's first documented act of physical violence against his wife was not, by the standards of the rest of the country, unusual. Plea deals to lesser charges are common. Charges getting dismissed after an agreed plea is common. The thing about that pipeline, when you read enough of these cases, is that it tends to produce one specific kind of bad outcome. It separates the abuser from any meaningful consequence at the moment when intervention would still work, when the abuse is escalating but has not yet become lethal. By the time the abuse becomes lethal, the legal record on the abuser is, in most cases, a few dismissed misdemeanors that no one outside the immediate family even remembers. Melanie Lyon did the right thing in 2013. She filed the protective order. She filed for divorce. She moved her children out of state 1,800 miles to be with family that could help her keep them safe. Every step she took was the step that domestic violence advocates tell women to take. Every step she took was correct. And the Utah court system, when it dismissed her protective order in October of 2013 as part of an agreed mutual restraining order, a paperwork shortcut that is, in many divorce cases, completely standard, handed her ex-husband a legal document that made it look like the case had been settled mutually rather than that she had been actively running from him. That paperwork shortcut is what I keep thinking about, because it's not a single bad decision by a single bad judge. It's a structural choice that the Utah civil court system has been making in family violence cases for decades. The system prefers tidy mutual agreements over messy unilateral protections. The system rewards lawyers who can produce signed documents on both sides. The system, when faced with a wife who is genuinely terrified and a husband whose lawyer is willing to sign a mutual restraining order, treats those two postures as equivalent, even though, in any honest assessment, they are not. In 2025, more than a decade after the killings, Utah's family violence framework looks, on paper, somewhat different than it did in 2013. There are new risk assessment protocols. Protective orders are harder to dismiss without a finding of fact. Lethality assessment tools developed by domestic violence researchers are routinely used by law enforcement at the scene of misdemeanor arrests. Whether those changes would have caught Ronald Haskell specifically in 2008 or 2013 is one of those questions that nobody can really answer. The honest version is that he might still have walked. Determined abusers, with enough resources and enough cooperation from their wives' attorneys, can root around a lot of safeguards. But the chance that he would have walked is lower in 2025 than it was in 2013. The system has, slowly, learned from cases like this. 6 dead in a living room in Spring, Texas, is the kind of headline that forces legislatures to act, even when the legislative response is years late. If you stuck with me through this one, thank you. It is honestly one of the hardest cases I've ever put a script together for, because of the ages of the victims and because of how genuinely heroic Cassidy Stay had to be at 15 years old, in a living room, with a fractured skull, to do what she did. The grandparents whose lives she saved have, in every public interview since, called her their hero. I think that word fits. If a detail from this case stayed with you, Cassidy's 911 call with a head injury, the FedEx uniform Haskell wore that he had bought legitimately as a former employee, the mutual restraining order that ended Melanie's protective order in 2013, the 1,800-mile move from Utah to Texas that should have been enough distance and wasn't, leave a comment with what hit you. I read all of them. One last thing before I sign off. Cassidy Stay was asked, after the trial, what she had been thinking in those moments when she got up off the living room floor and walked to the phone. She did not, in any of the interviews she gave, describe heroism. She did not describe courage. She described practical thinking. She said she had remembered something her father had taught her growing up, that if something bad happens, the most important thing you can do is to give the police as much specific information as you can, as quickly as you can. He had taught her that years before. She had remembered it on the day she needed it most. Stephen Stay died in his own living room before he ever knew that the lesson he had given his oldest daughter was going to save the lives of her grandparents that afternoon. 3 guys, 3 completely different stories. Hardin spent decades inside the system before anyone caught him, and even after he got caught, he found a way to use that same system to walk out the front gate. Dorner didn't hide at all. He told everyone exactly what he was going to do, in writing, and then did it anyway. And Haskell, honestly, his case doesn't even need a badge or a manifesto to be terrifying. He just needed someone to open a door. Here's the thing that actually gets me, though. In every one of these cases, it was one person who changed the outcome. A corrections officer who eventually noticed something was off. A deputy who got shot and survived to give a description. A 15-year-old who played dead on a living room floor and then called 911 with a bullet still in her head. Not the system, not the training, just people. So, tell me in the comments, out of these 3, which one would you have seen coming? Which one do you think the system actually had a real shot at stopping? If you made it this far, you already know what to do. Subscribe. There's more of this every week. See you in the next one.